Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar entitled ROGD, What We Know and What We're Learning. I'm Angus Fox, I'm the manager of Genspect. I want to start by saying that today is Trans Day of Remembrance, which is a day to remember all those trans people who have lost their lives over the years. So it's a very sad day for some people, especially if you've loved a trans person who died by suicide. And many of us will be aware of these tragic deaths and will rightly wish to memorialise them. There's another related but distinct experience which is very rarely remembered and is often totally unknown to the wider public. Many young, vulnerable people, mostly adolescents, have got caught up in a phenomenon known as Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria, or ROGD. So these are kids who are lost and lonely. Many of them who do transition later reassess. Some go on to detransition, and tragically there are those who go on to take their own lives as well. There's no evidence that the dysphoric feelings they had were any less acute than anyone else's, and rather than medicalization, this vulnerable cohort of young people needs our help. They need gentle, compassionate psychotherapy that provides appropriate support, not misinformed enabling. And these other voices, they have an equal right to be heard and a right to be remembered. And so do the voices of their parents, one of whom you will hear speak today. This area is highly contentious and there are many different viewpoints, some of which do not sit easily with one another. As long as everyone remains courteous and does not resort to ad hominem attacks or aggressive behaviour, we welcome diverse perspectives. What we intend to do today is provide a deeper understanding of this new cohort, and we trust that all participants will bear in mind that the experience of one person does not negate the experience of another. So we're going to start off with Genspect's founder, Stella O'Malley, who'll be talking about how clinicians work with ROGD. Then we'll be moving to a parent campaigner from Australia, who you see here, who'll be talking about her story from theory to reality when ROGD hits your family. Then we're going to move across to Dr. David Bell, who's a former consultant psychiatrist and ex-governor at the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust in the UK, whose talk will be entitled First Do No Harm. Then to Dr. Lisa Littman, who's a public health researcher from the USA, whose talk is entitled Psychosocial Factors and Gender Dysphoria. And then we'll have questions. We welcome you to make comments in the chat. We'd love to have discussion in the chat, as long as it stays respectful. Please do appreciate that this is brought to you in good faith. We're trying to help vulnerable people. No one has all the answers, and we're trying to ask the most thoughtful and relevant questions. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions at the end using the Q&A function. So you've got the chat and the Q&A function, and you're welcome to use both, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we possibly can. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Stella.
Thank you very much, Angus. I'm going to share my screen and I'll kick off. You're very welcome. And that was a lovely kind of introduction you gave. I'm just going to put up a couple of my credentials in the background here so you can see them. But and you know, some of the work that I've done, I've written a few books on mental health, and I've had kind of an increasing interest in trans issues and gender issues and ROGD and other related kind of concerns since 2017, and I did the film Trans Kids It's Time to Talk in 2018. This is a picture of me when I was a kid. There's a reason why I'm providing this picture. It's not that I'm proud of my family. It's that when I was a kid, I had a very intense experience with gender. I was born in 1974, so it was a very different time. I don't know if you can guess which kid was me in that picture. It's the kid in the white t-shirt and the blue jeans. So I've kind of got a stripe, a blue and red stripe. So obviously I'm presenting very much as a boy there. I'm about 10 years of age. And it was my brother's confirmation. The reason why I put that up is to say that, yeah, I did have those gender issues, and I had them for many, many, many years. It goes back from the age of about 3 right through, and puberty was very, very difficult for me. And I wasn't celebrated. I wasn't encouraged. I wasn't dismissed. I was kind of let be myself, if you follow me, and follow my own road. And I did follow my own road, and I'm now a mother of 2 children, and I'm very glad I didn't transition. But I kept an interest in trans issues as a result of it, because I'd had such a long, intense experience of gender-related distress. It wasn't, I'm smiling that in that picture, it wasn't fun. It was very distressing. I felt really alienated from myself, from my body. And when I look back, I often think I was misogynist. I hated girls, hated everything to do with them. And yeah, I moved on from it, and I'm very comfortable. I'm very lucky to be comfortable in my own skin. These are a few organizations that I'm involved in that have sprung up in the last few years very much as a result of demand. And if anybody does want to know, further resources, contact Genspect and we'll make sure to send you it. And we will be recording this talk, so it will be on YouTube. So to kind of get the talk kicked off, there are lots of different ways to treat gender dysphoria. In many ways, there's many ways into gender dysphoria. There's many ways out of gender dysphoria. For example, you can change your mind, so the individual's sense of gender can become aligned with their biological body. You can change your body. The individual's body can be altered to align with their sense of gender. And also you can learn to manage your distress, which is pretty classic, therapist kind of world. The individual's ability to cope with and manage their distress can be improved with a range of different approaches in relation to self-understanding, self-compassion, emotional regulation, behavior management, and distress tolerance. There's an exceptionalism often brought to gender as if it's like no other condition, when in many ways it is very, very similar to many different conditions that many clinicians would work with. Now, this is a simplified version of how a clinician might look at it, but sometimes the simple can kind of categorize your mind and clear things up, and it can be quite helpful. Now, I know Dr. Bell will be talking about this later on, but I just want to give a quick for anybody, because this is right at the beginning of the conference. I want to point this out. Like, trans isn't gender dysphoria, and gender dysphoria isn't ROGD. So trans is there's many different definitions of trans. One I personally prefer is this one, which is trans is an umbrella term to describe people whose gender is not the same as and doesn't sit comfortably with their biological sex. And it's not a diagnosis, it's a description of somebody. And very often it's a self-identified description. So I could identify as trans if I wished, and anybody can. Gender dysphoria is a very different thing. Gender dysphoria is a diagnosable mental health condition, and it's the psychological distress that results from an incongruence between a person's biological sex and their sense of identity. That could be what you would argue I had when I was a child. It wasn't called that because it had a different name, but that's very common in mental health. Conditions go through different terms depending on the context of the era. And so, yeah, gender-related distress is what I often call it. And it's a kind of a horrible feeling of, I shouldn't be this, I should be something else. I should be non-binary, I should be a man. And it feels very pervasive, and it's a very uncomfortable feeling. And then rapid onset gender dysphoria is a new phenomenon. Dr. Lisa Littman is here to talk about it. She noticed it, first of all. Many people were noticing it, but she got the study out that, interviewed something like 257 parents and discussed what was happening to these adolescents. It's a new presentation that describes a phenomenon of adolescents who suddenly and rapidly experience a socially mediated expression of gender dysphoria. And so it has happened quickly. It's arrived out of nowhere. The most common question I'm asked is, where did all this come from? And I think Dr. Bell will be touching on that later on. Like, what has happened? It's not a diagnosis, it's a description of a phenomenon. So I just wanted to clear that up before we go any further. So like I said, Dr. Littman termed rapid onset gender dysphoria to describe a phenomenon of teenagers identifying as trans. I'm sure she'll probably flinch at my simplification of that, but you know what I mean? Sometimes you have to say, stay simple to get the message across, so she can clear it up later with more in-depth analysis. ROGD presents in young people quickly and intensely, and a key point for clinicians to know, usually after an extended amount of time spent online. It's the most common kind of factor that you hear about, and it seems to be the result of social contagion and or emotional distress. For example, in the UK, there's been a 5,337% rise in the numbers of female children presenting at the Tavistock. And so if you look at these two graphs, you'll see what is historically children who had gender-related distress were very small in number, were like people like myself, and it presented young. So for me, it goes back to as far back as I can go. So that'd be about the age of 3. And it's very intense, and it's very loud. I remember Ken Zucker, who I hope is here. I know he registered today. Remember, he said, when a child presents as, with gender dysphoria, the town knows it. It's loud, if you follow me. While ROGD seems to be a different phenomenon, it's not very young children. These are post-puberty, and it's generally after a long time online, and there generally seems to be some level of trauma attached. And you can see the numbers shot up as we became more online in the teens from 2012, 2013 onwards. It shot up fast. And if you look at the second graph, you will see that it shot up and girls suddenly presented. So historically, it was much more common among boys. I know I'm a girl, but it was much, much more common among boys. And there was 2 major cohorts. There was young children, who are boys most often, and middle-aged men. And suddenly, out of nowhere, adolescent girls came in very fast in kind of between 2012 to 2021. And it's an extraordinary change in the demographic. And not only that, their personality, their life experiences has changed. These are stats I've taken from Dr. Littman's study. 43% had a history of being isolated from their peers. 45% were engaging in self-harm prior to the ROGD kind of presentation. 48% had experienced a traumatic or stressful event prior to presenting with the ROGD. 63% had other diagnoses such as psychiatric disorders or neurodevelopmental disabilities. And so if you're a clinician working with this, you need to be aware of these facts so that you can work and be at your best and present, so that you're not seeing gender dysphoria as an encapsulated condition, and you're aware 63% with rapid onset gender dysphoria that's presenting adolescents might have a psychiatric disorder. Certainly they did in this study, a psychiatric disorder or a neurodevelopmental disability. That would be things like ASD, ADHD, anxiety, eating disorders, OCD, and then 69% had social anxiety during adolescence. This is a vulnerable group. This is a very vulnerable group of young people. And so if you look at this, this is the common sequence of events for ROGD to be announced. Sometimes it's following a traumatic event. It's pretty much always after an extended amount of time spent online. Then the young person very often, not always, but very often identifies as gay, lesbian, or bi. And then after they've identified as that or some level of queer, they announce their transgender identification. Very, very often, this gender dysphoria that they kind of proclaim will be self-diagnosed, and it'll be via internet influences. They often know somebody either in real life or online or from TV. They know somebody who has come out as trans, and they are often very besotted with the trans politics, the trans kind of world, because it is very alluring. There's almost nothing more alluring in life than for somebody to say, you can be somebody different. You can be somebody different with a new name, a new identity, and you can get rid of the old identity, and you can be a completely new person. For parents, gender dysphoria often feels like another diagnosis at the end of a long list, and we'll be hearing from our parent campaigner after me. Some common features in ROGD youth: they're often quirky, they're very likable, socially awkward, intelligent. I knew them as a teenager, you knew them as a teenager, that clever, quirky person, naive, vulnerable, very often heightened sensitivity and emotionality, hypervigilance around gender issues, very often online self-diagnosis and online influences, a politicized understanding of gender that would never have presented pre-2012 or so. A very much what's commonly I've noted as a clinician, and I work a lot in this field these days, the burden of privilege tends to weigh heavily on a lot of these young people. Not all of them, it's sometimes to give a talk, you have to give generalizations. They can be quite compliant and obedient until the day they announce trans identification. They can be a very obedient type who follows the rules and often hasn't found their strong voice, and they find their strong voice through a trans identification, socially mediated, as I've mentioned before, and conditions such as ASD, ADHD, OCD, anxiety disordered eating patterns, and trauma. So they're common features. They're not always, I'm not saying they're always, I'm saying they're notable features. So as I said, key influencing factors would be things like anime, DeviantArt, Tumblr, Reddit, Discord, YouTube videos. Some of the YouTube videos are incredibly influential. The peer group, very often there's a cheerleading female friend groups. That might arrive after, they might have spent an awful lot of time online, and the female friend group might arrive after that are cheerleading. And they've found their world in a way. They can be very strong media influences. There's a huge glamorization of the trans identity, and which is great that we are kind of living in a world where everybody's accepted to be who they are. But it's very important that there's lots of ways to be edgy. There's lots of ways to be yourself, and that I'd love to live in a world where boys could wear dresses, where it's just not that big a deal. But at the moment, it does feel really quite confining, especially for boys with gender expression. It's very often well-meaning, encouraging, and I would argue quite misinformed adults. And LGBTQ workshops and seminars can sometimes bring about a very keen interest in gender, and that can move into a very strong online presence. And if you're a clinician working with ROGD, for starters, number one, you check out the tech use, check out the social media use, figure out. And I've found, with anybody I've worked with, they want to reduce their tech use. They want to reduce their social media use. They're well aware that they're overusing their tech, and they're well aware that it's a heavy influence. Very often there's complex pre-existing family dynamics in probably every family in the world, but working with the attachment and the family relationships can be very helpful in this context. Again, working with intergenerational or direct trauma can be very helpful, as a child who's trying to figure themselves out and who needs a bit of a hand in kind of processing their trauma. Psychosocial factors need to be brought. Like I said before, it's not an encapsulated condition. It needs a wider understanding. It can be very helpful for clinicians to work with the body, do some body work. Sasha Ayad is really, really good when she talks about that, the therapist who I work with on the Wider Lens podcast. And also their experiences of puberty. It can be very, very difficult for a girl to have puberty young, and they can often, maybe their breast develop very early. For a 9 or 10-year-old to manage periods is a really difficult challenge. I don't think it's given enough kind of attention. Just the whole logistics of trying to figure out how to manage periods and pads and leaking and all that. And I know none of you want to hear about it, but it's incredibly important that we highlight how difficult that can be. And puberty is getting earlier and earlier. And these girls are very young, and the emotional capacity to deal with the fact that your body, it looks very sexual at a young age is very difficult. Following on that, puberty arriving late for boys can be very difficult. It's a different experience, but it can be very difficult. The impact of co-occurring mental health difficulties, as I said before, ASD, ADHD, emotion distress. This is just very much what every clinician knows about. Regulation, self-compassion. Now, you would need to know things like issues pertaining to social transition. People are very, I would say, uninformed around what's the impact of social transition. That means the change of name, the change of pronoun, passing, the pros and cons of wanting to pass, breast binding, tucking, and things like that. It can be very helpful for the clinician to work with and explore conscious or unconscious homophobia and sexual development and attraction. And very often I've noticed in my own work that there seems to be a repression of their sexuality, a repression of their sexual development and their sexual attraction. And in its place, gender has kind of subsumed their sexuality. And that can be a very, an interesting and challenging issue that could be approached. I want to point out that there is a difference between affirmation and confirmation, because a lot of people hear about the affirmative approach. There's no peer-reviewed long-term evidence base to support the affirmative therapeutic approach. It's a new approach, very much kind of in conjunction with the escalating numbers. WPATH released, their standards of care in 2012. And with that, the affirmative approach has kind of gained a lot of ground in the last 10 years. But many clinicians, including myself, believe that the affirmative model is necessary but not sufficient. You do affirm and support the young person as they learn to express themselves. You affirm your client's feelings, but that doesn't mean you confirm every thought or belief that they might have. And it's very seldom helpful to concretize every idea and belief an individual might have. So if you slip from affirming, which is affirming their emotions and affirming the level, the depth of their distress, and you move into confirming, you can inadvertently remove autonomy, you can impede the therapeutic process, and you can also get in the way of opportunities for therapeutic progress because you're confirming and you're concretizing perhaps something that might have been a more complex emotion. So in many ways, you could say clinicians are seeking understanding while adolescents are seeking identity. Adolescents should be seeking identity. That's developmentally appropriate. That is the time for adolescents to seek their identity. Erik Erikson did great work, the great Swiss and German psychologist, about identity formation in adolescence. And it's very well established that that's what we do. We put on different hats between the ages of around about 12 and 25, and we become those identities. We all did it. And you very much embody your identity as you're passing through, as you're figuring out who you are. And then when you've gone through the different phases, hopefully unimpeded, without kind of concretizing anything, when you hit your mid-20s or so, you find yourself and you know where you are, and you kind of know how to kind of go forward. So it's very important that we don't impede that kind of formation process by saying, this is your identity, go with it, concretize it, and safeguard it. I think freedom to move in and out of identities is quite important. Both parents and adolescents might seek the therapist, they very often do, and there is a significant lack of therapists who are working in this field. And the adolescent often seeks a confirmation, brand me, seek, confirm my identity. And the parents are looking for a resolution, while the therapist is often seeking a deeper understanding of what's actually going on. I think we need to be careful that adolescents might use their identity as a shield to prevent further exploration. It's not a new concept. We've often seen it as clinicians, that sometimes the client can come in saying, I want to talk about this. And actually, as Fritz Perls said, what's going on and what's really going on. It's very, very common within the therapeutic context for somebody to come in looking for treatment about, should I leave my husband? And then a few weeks later, I'm talking about their alcoholism. Common, it's not unusual, but just we need to be aware that identity can be used as a shield. They might construct an imaginary identity online. It's very important that any clinician is aware of the online media influences. And they might repress their sexuality, and they might repress it within a gender identity. I do want to point out there's a very big difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. It's not the same as being gay or lesbian. It's a very different experience. It presents very differently. The DSM-5, which is, the kind of the clinician's manual for diagnosis, says gender identity is different from sexual orientation. Pronouns, names, and past personal histories don't need to be revised when a child comes out as gay. Being gay doesn't require active participation on the part of family, friends, and loved ones. If somebody's gay, you don't have to change their name. You don't have to think, what pronoun do I use? You don't have to do anything except, yeah, well done. Nothing is required from anybody else. Medical transition is not the same as coming out as gay. Why? Because medical transition carries a very heavy medical burden on the body. And so if you go from puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones, your fertility will be impacted. Your sexual functioning will be impacted. And I know, because I was that kid, I know that I couldn't have cared less. If somebody had said, you won't orgasm easily, I wouldn't have even heard them. I wouldn't have even cared. I wouldn't have even known what orgasm was. And I would have been very, very uneasy around sexuality and a development. I wouldn't have wanted to talk about it. Weirdly enough, I was told I was infertile when I was 25. And I was told I was infertile, and I couldn't care less. I didn't care. I was like, yeah, really, really. I didn't hear it, didn't care. By the time I was 32, I was like this, breastfeeding earth mother. I changed a lot in that time. And, I really didn't care when I was told that I could be infertile. And they were saying things like egg harvesting, and I can't even hear you. I just didn't care. I changed. So when a child says they don't care about their future sexuality or their future fertility, I don't think it is the responsible adult's role to listen to what the child is saying at that point. We listen, but we have to make sure that we remain as the adults in the room, and we make sure that we understand that sometimes a child can't quite conceptualize the impact of loss of fertility when they're 12. I want to talk a little bit about repression and shame. I love this picture. I love my trans body, because I think that is how trans could be a lovely way of being. You know what I mean? That they love their trans body, as opposed to, let's pretend I'm not trans. What about loving your trans body? Anyway, that's neither here nor there. As I say here, repression is a defense mechanism that, this from Derek Russell. Derek Russell Davis, sorry, my mistake. Repression is a defense mechanism that ensures that what is unacceptable to the conscious mind and would, if recalled, arouse anxiety, is prevented from entering it. When we're repressing, we are preventing. We don't know we're preventing it coming in the door. So it's very difficult, and it's the job of therapists to work with repression, and it's complex. And so we need to be aware of things like internalized homophobia, internalized misogyny. These are big issues. Internalized misandry and stealth transition. These are all kind of, to me, something that every clinician should be aware of. An awful lot of people have come to me over the years, especially detransitioners, saying things like, I didn't want to be a butch lesbian. It was an awful idea. I wanted to be a boy instead. And so we need to be conscious of that. When you're working with somebody with ROGD, there can be a lot of guilt and self-loathing, a lot of, as I mentioned before, cultural alienation, the burden of privilege, middle-class guilt. These are often scoffed at, and I think they shouldn't be. I think we need to realize that there can be, and you're going to see some crazy words coming up here, shame at being internalized classism, being one of them, internalized classism, shame at being cis white middle class, very common, cisophobia, I think that might be my own or from Twitter. Oikophobia I thought was quite interesting, which is the opposite of xenophobia, effectively hating of your own people, if you follow me. And then these are words people kind of came up on Twitter with me: internalized privilege phobia, thesaphobia, which is kind of when you hate your own status and your position. You can smile at this, you know what I mean? And yet I would say it's very difficult to have the role of the oppressor in the world. And it creates a lot of complex challenges of, I'm in the oppressor class. I don't want to be in the oppressor class. How can I get out of the oppressor class? I don't want to be in it. And I'm so unhappy. How could I be privileged and lucky when I'm a deeply unhappy, really, really distressed person? I couldn't be in this privileged class. I couldn't be. So where do I go? And so we need to be conscious of this as clinicians. I think it's smiled at and dismissed too often. The tasks of adolescents, any clinician will know that these are just common or garden tasks that all adolescents need to kind of work through. We're trying to work through with independence, emotional maturity, develop their coping skills. And so every clinician who's working with ROGD needs to be aware that these adolescents need to work through these complex emotional experiences. They're, might need help with their peer relations, adjust to their body development, their sexual maturation, start to renegotiate relationships with their adults, and identify some meaningful moral standards, values, and belief systems. And that lovely quote from Albert Ellis from EBT, a different type of psychology. He says, there are 3 musts that hold us back. I must do well, you must treat me well, and the world must be easy. Is that it? I can't see it. And the world must be easy. Yeah. He calls it masturbating, which always makes me giggle. But yeah, this idea that we have to learn our limitations. Sadly, it's an integral part of healthy functioning. We are restricted by our time and our place of birth. We didn't create ourselves. We didn't choose our parents. We didn't choose our bodies. There's certain kind of limitations of our existence. It's part of being born that we need to kind of bring into some therapy with some people because it's helpful. And so, like I said, identity formation is a well-established process. It becomes heightened during adolescence, and so it should. It's neurotypical. It's not neurotypical. It's typical of development of that point. between adolescence and maturity, that you become very heightened about your identity. And often adolescents develop an identity that reflects a sense of individuality, that connects people to, people in groups. And they can benefit from developing a positive identity within therapy if that's needed, to their gender, to their physical attributes, to their sexuality, to their ethnicity, to the birth circumstances. And sometimes a change in gender identity can manifest as a concrete physical solution to a psychic trauma. And it might lead to a belief that parts of the self can you discard, get rid of that bit. I don't want to be that. I want to be something else. I do think whenever you're working with ROGD, you need to be very aware that this comes in a social context, that there's an extraordinary level of celebration of trans identity. You can see I Am Jazz there, and that's from the latest I Am Jazz that will be out very soon. And also there's another trans kid, very well known in the media, Kai Shapley. And very often, the whole family become involved in the celebration. And while you could say that looks on the surface very positive, on another level, what would be my worry is that when you're over celebrating something, if I had been celebrated, I would have felt boxed and painted into a corner, because everybody would be cheering me on that I was this, and how would have I come out? And now, I'm lucky enough to have healthy sexual functioning and to have, I've had 2 children. I was very lucky that I didn't get channeled early or celebrated. Like I say, celebration can seem so great. And we all know the feeling of you're celebrated into something and you're kind of biting your lip thinking, well, yeah, but I've changed a little bit and I don't know how to tell everybody I've changed a little bit. So what we need is a kind of a neutral kind of positive environment. So it's kind of neutrally positive. You're not too excited and you're not too focused on it. So they're just letting themselves be. Things like the Babysitters Club, on TV, in the novel, there was no references in the novels, no references to trans at all. And because of the new kind of phenomenon, suddenly it got inserted into it. So it is something that we need to be aware of. I want to give I'm coming towards the end quite soon, I will, but can you be born in the wrong body? Born in the wrong body is a great description of a person's feeling, but it is not a diagnosis. Using this phrase can lead naive youths to believe that they can have a different body, when in truth, they can only change the body that they already have. So it's a very, very, I would say, inappropriate phrase. You can only be born. I didn't have a choice of bodies to be born in. I was born in my body. That was part of the birthing process. And so to say you're born in the wrong body is letting very vulnerable, naive people to think, I can have an option. I can be somebody else. I can have a different body. You can have a different outward body, but you can't have a different inward body. It's not actually possible. And so we need to be aware of the kind of the intense social phenomenon and the social context that's happening here. This is a quote from Dr. Littman's study. It's just a very weird scenario around the numbers that Dr. Littman noticed. The expectant prevalence of transgender young adult individuals is 0.7%. Yet more than a third of the friendship groups described in this study had 50% or more of the adolescents or young adults in the group becoming transgender identified in a similar time frame. So that was a localized increase to more than 70 times the expected prevalence rate. And so it's a complicated stat, but it's a very important one. So if it's 0.7 of the population, and yet in these friendship groups, it was 70 times that stat, you're kind of going, well, something is happening. I'm not sure what's happening, but it certainly needs exploration. It needs thought. We need to think about this, because when something is 70 times the expected prevalence rate, something's going on, and it needs thought and exploration. So about social contagion, it's the spread of effect or behavior through a population. It's most always historically been most common among adolescent girls, and you're aware of the huge rises among adolescent girls in this cohort. Peer contagion is the process where peers mutually influence each other. It's associated with gender dysphoria and also with depressive symptoms such as disordered eating, aggression, bullying, drug use. And very often the risk factors among social contagion among groups, among peer groups, would be co-rumination, excessive empathy, repetitive discussion of an issue, excessive reassurance. You can just so imagine these gorgeous friend groups, kind of, excessive empathy and excessive reassurance and repetitive discussion, positive reinforcement, and competitive friendship cliques. So just to be aware of that. I do think clinicians have to be very careful around their language and their terminology. You need to take some time to learn the language, the terminology, and the acronyms so they're not a superficial obstacle to therapeutic progress. Defenses can manifest through a fixation on language, and I think it would be the role of the clinician not to allow that fixation to become an impediment to good therapy. A robust but understanding and flexible approach is often very necessary. Mistakes will be made. I'm a great believer in mistakes being made. The language and terminology involved in gender-related distress is constantly changing, but making mistakes provides valuable opportunities for a therapeutic process. So you don't need to be afraid of making a mistake because we are fallible humans. I want to point out about social transition requires a change of name, pronouns, clothes, hairstyle. It can be a therapeutic intervention that increases the likelihood of full medical transition. Ken Zucker did a great article on that in 2019. It can solidify, or well, he mentions it and he describes it, can solidify and concretize the individual's perspective. And a depth perspective provides more insight for everybody. There isn't very much research. I shouldn't have said he wrote an article on it. There isn't very much research on social transition. We need masses more research on this phenomenon before we can figure out where we're going with it. I would say it's a very distinct psychosocial intervention. It shouldn't be undertaken without clinical supervision. It shouldn't be undertaken lightly. It's never been undertaken before. Never before have we heard of, it's, I'll put aside like freakishly tiny, vanishingly rare numbers. Children changing pronouns. This is new. This has not been done before. And so if you're part of a process that's undertaken to change names and pronouns, be aware there is no research long-term about this. We don't know what is the impact of that. A compassionate, curious, and flexible approach towards the use of young persons' names and pronouns can be helpful. I'm personally very for a compassionate, curious, and flexible approach to most distress. Just towards the end of this talk, I want to talk a little bit about suicide because there's an awful lot of talk around suicide with this. There's very little peer-reviewed evidence about suicidality and gender dysphoria, but the Tavistock does report, the Tavistock, Dr. Bell will talk about it later on, but it is the largest gender clinic for the NHS in the UK. They report, and this is a quote, that it's extremely rare among children expressing gender distress. The risk of suicide among gender dysphoric youth seems to be similar to the risk of suicide with other mental health challenges, such as anxiety, OCD, depression. The risk of suicide remains post-affirmation and or medical transition. So people have this misinformed view that if you affirm or if you medically transition, that it would change the risk of suicide. That hasn't been shown to be the case. The research is very paltry anyway, but one research I do know is that, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Dejna from 2011. It's a long-term follow-up of trans people, and it was taking place in Sweden. It was over about 40 years. And they noted that post-medical transition, that there was a dip, usually around about 10 years later, but that there was the post-medical transition person was 19 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population. And so that is an issue that we need to be very aware of. Now that the general population haven't got a diagnosable condition that these trans people might have, so already it's complicated numbers, but they are shocking numbers. 19 times more likely is a definite something that we have to be aware of. Personality disorders, psychosis, schizophrenia, drug dependence, they carry the highest risk of suicide. So please be aware, what are the comorbidities? What are the co-occurring issues that might be presenting with the person you're working with? Suicidality is sometimes linked to the wish of getting rid of aspects of yourself. This is Dr. Laura Edwards-Leeper. She's the chair of the Adolescent and Children section of WPATH, which is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And she said recently, very recently, as far as I know, there are no studies that say if we don't start these kids immediately on hormones when they say they want them, that they're going to commit suicide. So that is misguided. In terms of needing to intervene medically to prevent suicide and doing it quickly, I know of no studies that have shown that. That's Dr. Edward Sleeper. So we need to be very careful about how we talk about suicide when there actually is no real representation. There's been an awful lot of misinformed myths around suicidality and gender, and it needs to be cleared up because suicide is such a difficult topic. It's such a terrible tragedy when it happens. Families are devastated by it. And that's why we need very accurate analysis and very accurate information about who is suicidal, who is at risk, what should we do about it. We need to stay really rigidly into a very good, accurate analysis when it's something as serious as this. So this is a national report from Sweden, just released earlier this year, or else just late last year. It was quite recent anyway. And what it is it compared basically suicide mortality, people who died from suicide with different conditions. And as you'll see, the yellow is women and the orange is men. And you'll see the different kind of rates. Personality disorder was the highest, schizophrenia, harmful use and drug dependence, bipolar, depression. You'll see gender dysphoria and autism. You can see there's a spike there with gender dysphoria for women and men. I often wonder about the impact of testosterone. This is just an aside. I often wonder about the impact of testosterone on a female, because traditionally males are more likely to die by suicide. So suicidality covers suicidal ideation, which means thoughts about taking your own life, and it also covers plans and suicide attempts. Suicide plans and attempts tend to be more common among females. Suicide itself tends to be more common from males. And suicide contagion is a very real risk, and it's triggered by exposure to suicide or suicidal behavior. And often the way we speak about suicide is incredibly powerful. And so, they created these guidelines in 1989 about suicidality and how the media needed to talk about suicide. And when Kurt Cobain from Nirvana died in the early 90s, the media were very, very good in reporting because they had the guidelines and they were very assiduous in following them. And then many years later, and there wasn't many deaths as a result of that terrible tragedy. Many years later, sorry, I'll just finish there. Robin Williams died by suicide, and we'd become sloppy. We've become sloppy because of social media. And so this kind of adherence to the media guidelines around speaking about suicide got thrown out the window. And there was a huge contagious effect after the death of Robin Williams because of the media. The general consensus is because of how the media portrayed this. We need to be really careful around it. And I just think it's very important to kind of really drive that point home. And the clinician does need to, I am finishing now, I'm sure you're rolling your eyes by now, but just coming to the end, we do need to manage unrealistic expectations as clinicians. Some young and vulnerable people, they think they can fully change sex. They can fully embody the other person. So I remember speaking with one person, and they thought by taking testosterone, the impact of, let's say, breast cancer, or the impact they didn't have the same risk factors of females anymore because they were now male. And so when I said, well, the impact of testosterone on the female body is very harsh, they said, oh no, but I'll be male, so it won't be hard on me. And that to me was somebody who needed more information about the reality of their actual biological functioning inside their body. Clinicians need to inform themselves and the young person about the realities of medical transition, so they can fully inform the young person about what to expect about the burden of medical transition. Addressing issues such as gender role stereotypes can liberate the young person from feeling the need to conform to society's gendered expectation. Therapy for the young person can be painful work, and therapists and parents should be empathetic, patient, aware of the relapse cycle, respectful of the young person's defenses. This is a diverse experience. Sexuality, ROGD, trauma, comorbidity, they're all complex issues. They affect a diversity of people in a diversity of ways. It requires sensitive debate, which I hope we're going to have today. One person's experience doesn't negate another person's. Diversity shouldn't imply fragility. We each have an obligation to question our assumptions, our opinions, our ideas, and we should be able to do it with a robustness of spirit. So I hope you found this talk helpful. We do have resources. If you look on Genspect, that's the place to go if you want to hear further kind of information about this talk and about any resources. Thank you very much.
Lovely, thank you very much for that, Stella. So that the address for the website is www.genspect.org, and you'll find everything you need in there, hopefully. Okay, we're broadly on time. With a small bit of Celtic flexibility, we're basically on time. So the next person that we're going to hand over to is Jude, who is joining us from Australia. So Jude, over to you.
Thank you, Angus. Hi, I'm speaking to you today as the parent of a young woman who declared a transgender identity aged 17, a month prior to turning 18, completely out of the blue. So many parents feel that they cannot speak out for fear of harming the relationship with their child. I'm speaking because, as I have sadly discovered over the last 3 years, this phenomenon is much, much bigger than my family, and we most certainly do need to talk about it and raise awareness of what is being done to our children. Our daughter has just turned 21 and has been in the transgender bubble for just over 3 years. She had been estranged from us for the past year. However, she miraculously reached out to us exactly 1 week ago. For that reason, the last week has been a very emotional one for our family. There has been so much damage done, and the healing process will be a long and rocky road. Yet right now, I have a glimmer of hope that I certainly did not have when I started writing this speech several weeks ago. Our daughter was raised in a loving and supportive family. She has 3 older half-brothers who are now 31, 33, and 36, and a younger brother who is now 16. They were all raised by us in the same loving way as we raised our daughter. We have a fabulous relationship with all of her brothers. Growing up, she was not particularly girly and did not like dolls, for example. But I thought nothing of that because I hated dolls as a kid, and I was a bit of a tomboy myself. She loved soccer and handball. She was a brown belt in Taekwondo. She tried so many extracurricular activities: dance, singing, gymnastics, swimming, tennis, to name a few. She used to walk with me every morning when I walked our dogs, and went to the gym with me as well. She enjoyed shopping with me and choosing her own clothes. We would go and have our nails painted together. We would go to plays and concerts together. We had such a close and loving relationship. She was very smart and did really well at school. She was bullied at school, and as a result of the bullying and the lack of support from the school, we moved her to a new school when she was 13 years old. That went well for the first 2 years, and she had a stable friendship group of really lovely girls. Around the time she turned 15, she switched friendship groups. The new group had a girl who did not identify as a girl, and that was my first introduction to gender ideology. I felt that the new friends had a very negative influence on our daughter. Our daughter started experiencing mental health problems in early 2016, shortly after turning 15, and around the same time she changed friendship groups. For 3 years, while she was 15, 16, and 17, these mental health problems continued. We moved through both the public system, called CAMS, here, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, and the private mental health systems in our efforts to find help for our daughter. We collected diagnoses of anxiety, depression, bipolar, and possible borderline personality disorder in that 3-year period. We took our daughter to over 70 medical appointments related to her mental health in that 3-year period. At all times, we were treated well by the medical professionals who were treating our daughter. We were described as loving and supportive parents. Our daughter did not respond well to medication for the anxiety and depression. It actually made her feel worse. When we declined to continue with medication, both in the public and the private clinical settings, at no time were we criticised or treated badly by the medical professionals who are treating our daughter. CAMS said they would not see her anymore if she was not medicalised, but by then we had found a private psychiatrist and he did not insist on medicalisation. CAMS most certainly did not try to report us to Child Protection Services or badmouth us because we did not want to medicalise our daughter for her mental health problems. We were focusing on diet, exercise, love, support and psychotherapy. Over 2018, our daughter's mental health became much worse. We found out she was cutting herself and binge eating. She'd always been very conscious of what she ate in a healthy way, as she'd been a vegetarian for several years. In hindsight, I believe that this time period was when she started focusing on transgender. She ended up having a 4-week admission to the mental health ward of a local private hospital in June of 2018, as it reached the point that she was refusing to get out of bed and refusing to go to school. When she came out of hospital after those 4 weeks, she went and cut her hair short. The next few months were an extremely traumatic period for our family. She barely attended school, became aggressive and verbally abusive towards us and her younger brother. She was lying, stealing, binge eating, and would not do anything that we asked her to do. I found out she was smoking marijuana. If we wanted to go out as a family with her younger brother to, say, a soccer match, she would declare she was anxious and suicidal so that I could not go. She became extremely manipulative. The stress we were under was enormous. Our son was 13 at that point in time, and the distress of her abusive behaviour caused him to become anorexic. I remember him curling up in a fetal position on the floor and sobbing, begging her to stop her out-of-control behaviour. I guess our son saw that his intake of food was the one thing that he could control. We were pretty much shattered as a family. I remember sitting in her GP's office sobbing and begging for help. It really was a nightmare. I believe it was over this time period she started to become engrossed with online trans sites. I later found a history in her web browser full of trans searches and sites. Then in October 2018, she announced all over social media that she was in fact a male named Josh. She claimed she'd told people at school months before and had been going by that name at school for some time. She told us that everyone at school, including the teachers, were supportive. Considering I had been in contact with the school regularly because of her mental health problems and the fact that she had many, many absences from school, I was stunned to find out that no one from school had contacted us about her transgender announcement. She had a scheduled visit to her psychiatrist that week that she announced she was trans, and she told her psychiatrist she was suicidal. So he insisted that we take her to our local public hospital for admission to the adolescent mental health ward. The psychiatric registrar who admitted our daughter to hospital said he thought that she had borderline personality disorder. After an all-night admission, which my husband accompanied her with, I went to the hospital to visit her the following day. When I asked to see our daughter, I was told that I had a son. Already above her name, her bed was the male name. I was aware that there were 2 other girls who attended her drama group who were also saying they were boys. So I was very sceptical of her announcement of trans. She had never displayed any signs of gender dysphoria. My scepticism was dismissed by the staff of the mental health ward. As parents who did not immediately affirm our child's declaration of transgender, we were shamed and bullied by the medical professionals in that hospital ward. All of our voiced concerns were swept aside, and we were put down by the hospital staff in front of our daughter, accused of being bigoted, not inclusive and transphobic. We were told that we must accept that we now had a son or she would kill herself. They said, "Would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter?" They said they wanted to introduce her to a transgender staff member. The very next day was a Saturday, and I was called by the hospital to come and take our daughter out on day leave. I remember thinking at that time that they could not be too concerned about her being suicidal if they sent her home on day leave 24 hours after being admitted. At a family meeting at the hospital, we were ridiculed for dressing her like a girl when she was little. They were not one bit interested in her complex 3-year mental health history. We were told that she needed an immediate referral to an endocrinologist for hormones. She was 17 and we said no, that we did not agree to the referral and that we were returning to her GP and her private psychiatrist. They needed our agreement for that referral. The hospital went ahead with the referral and wrote up her discharge summary, saying that we did agree to the referral for hormones. Our GP recommended that we take her to a private psychiatrist in our hometown who specialised in gender. The only trouble was it was a 6 months waiting list before we could get in to see him. From that point in time, being the hospital admission, our relationship with our daughter deteriorated significantly. She came out of hospital after 5 nights and immediately shaved her head. The abuse she directed towards us escalated, and she was pretty much out of control. The lying, binge eating and manipulative behaviour continued. She had another scheduled 3-week hospital admission in November, December of 2018 in the same mental health ward of the same private hospital that she'd been in 5 months earlier, except this time they pretended that she was a boy. There was no improvement in her behaviour. She left the hospital on day leave against the wishes of her treating psychiatrist to attend the endocrinologist appointment that had been made as a result of her public hospital admission, the appointment that we did not agree to, but by this time she had turned 18. When I went searching, I was absolutely stunned about what I found in the browser history of our daughter's computer. It was almost unbelievable. YouTube videos of young girls singing the praises of testosterone, showcasing the changes to their bodies and cheering each other on, bragging about surgeries and showing off the scars of double mastectomies. It was macabre. I felt like I had landed in the middle of some sort of alien world, some parallel universe. How could anyone be cheering all these young people on to do such harm to themselves? I can honestly say I've never been as disturbed by anything in my entire life. I found messages from transgender adults cheering our daughter on and telling her to get rid of her unsupportive family. Snip, snip, the mother effers was one phrase I will never forget. That phrase came from an Australian trans adult who was portrayed in our media as some sort of hero. All I could see was red flags and grooming. As a family, we were on the verge of breaking down. The stress was unbearable. We were subject to daily torrents of verbal abuse and were called the most despicable things. I was told I was a disgusting and pathetic parent, a white privileged bigot, a boring heterosexual, a transphobe. That abuse went on and on. It was like someone had put a script in her head because it did not sound like our daughter at all. The things she was saying were just bizarre. She would stand with her face so close to mine and unleash her fury. I remember going out with friends one night and coming home to find my husband cowering and hiding in the garden just to escape her rages. We limped through Christmas and the New Year and went on our annual family holiday in January of 2019. She did everything in her power to spoil the holiday, and it wasn't a good time for the rest of us. She was meant to be in her final year of school in 2019. However, due to missing most of the previous year, she could not continue with school. We suggested she do a 1-year university course that would give her the equivalent of her school leaving certificate. She enrolled in the course, and on the day she was due to start, she wouldn't get out of bed, telling me that she had taken pills. I called an ambulance and she was taken to hospital. I think I was just skin and bone myself at that time. I lost so much weight with the constant stress. I really don't know how we managed to keep going. When I say it was like living in a war zone, I am not exaggerating. A few weeks later, after the usual torrent of daily abuse from her, I told her I was not going to be treated like that anymore, and her brother lunged at her, and we had to restrain him. She left the house and went up the road to her glitter family, a girl she went to school with whose mother would pretend that she was a boy. She told the mother her father had threatened her, so the mother took her to the police station, and later that evening the police knocked on our door and a domestic violence order was served on my husband. The police did not even bother to come and talk to us or find out our side of what had happened or how she had been behaving towards us. We realised at that point in time we could no longer have her living with us. A friend of ours owned a house that had rooms that were rented out to university students for accommodation, and luckily one room was vacant, so we moved her in there and helped pay the rent. It was only a few blocks from our house. She immediately started on testosterone and dropped out of the university course. I was still having some contact with her over the course of that year, which was 2019. We tried to challenge the domestic violence order in court. However, after being adjourned several times and clocking up thousands of dollars in legal bills, we just gave up. It was too distressing and a ridiculous waste of money. At her request, I went to an appointment with the endocrinologist in May 2019. At that point, I had not seen her since March when she moved out, and I wasn't aware that she'd started testosterone. I later found out that she'd started testosterone at the second appointment with the endocrinologist. She'd seen the endocrinologist in the December previously and then was given a script for testosterone in March 2019. There was no psychiatry, no psychology, no examination of her 3-year mental health history. A seriously mentally unwell teenager given hormones that would make irreversible changes to her body. My sister, who was a medical practitioner, came to the endocrinologist appointment with me. There was a multidisciplinary team of 3 people at the meeting, the paediatric endocrinologist, a nurse and a social worker. I explained to them that we were waiting to see the private psychiatrist who specialised in gender, and we'd made that appointment to see him almost 6 months prior because he had a long waiting list and our appointment was not till the following month, which was June. The multidisciplinary team said, "Oh, we are so pleased to meet you." Yet they sat there at that meeting and did not bother to tell me that they had already started her on testosterone in the March. I was suspicious because her voice had started to go gravelly. When I asked them, were they aware of her extensive mental health history, they said no, they were not. This was despite her being referred to them by the adolescent mental health ward of the very same hospital in which the endocrinologist had her clinic. The endocrinologist said, "Don't you just want your daughter to be happy?" I honestly could not believe what I was hearing. Then they said they were referring her on to an adult endocrinologist as she was now 18. We accompanied her to the gender psychiatrist appointment the following month, and he diagnosed her with complex PTSD, which he said was caused by the childhood bullying. He was shocked that she had been started on testosterone and said that he would not have recommended it. He then told us that he was closing his books to anyone under 25 years of age, so he could not see her again. By now, I had nearly a year of research under my belt. I remember finding Lisa Littman's research and rejoicing. I remember finding Abigail Shrier's first article, "When Your Daughter Defies Biology." I remember finding First Wave Now and Parents of ROGD Kids. I remember being put in contact via the USA with an Australian mum who I ended up speaking to for hours. My goodness, I was actually not alone in my scepticism. The more I researched, the more gender critical articles I found, and the more I realised how shocking and widespread this medical scandal actually was. In September of the year of 2019, I accompanied our daughter to an appointment with the adult endocrinologist. I took a stack of those articles I had read to the adult endocrinologist and tried to engage her in a discussion about how concerned we were about our daughter's mental health and how many people were starting to speak up about the social contagion. I was dismissed by the adult endocrinologist, who told me, "Your daughter is over 18, she can do what she likes." I remember being in total disbelief. How could a medical practitioner have so little regard for their seriously mentally unwell patient? Our daughter's life continued to spiral. She refused to spend Christmas with us that year. I actually found out she was going to get on a plane and fly to another part of Australia to meet a trans person she met online, a complete stranger. We managed to stop her doing that. 2020 rolled around and she was still doing nothing with her life. I encouraged her to seek mental health help and arranged an admission to a different private hospital with a mental health ward. The hospital had been recommended by a friend. She went in voluntarily in February 2020 for 6 weeks. The psychiatrist she was under refused to discuss her trans identification with us or acknowledge our concerns about the global spike in young women presenting as transgender. It was a total waste of time. She was discharged as COVID was closing in on Australia, and I suggested she go and stay with my 2 sisters who were providing palliative care to our elderly father, who had been discharged from hospital after a fall and we thought he was going to die. My sisters saw firsthand the extent of her mental health problems. She did not get out of bed before 4 p.m. every day. No matter what they did, she refused to try and help herself. After 3 weeks staying with them, she went back to the student accommodation and stayed locked in her room doing nothing. In June of that year, I hadn't been able to contact her for a few days, so I went to her room and knocked on her door, and she finally answered. I can honestly say I've never seen someone living in such squalor. No sheets on the bed, a sea of clothes and towels, takeaway food remnants. My heart just broke. It took me 2 days and countless loads of washing to clean the place up. We eventually had her accepted into a program through the private hospital that she had been in earlier in that year, and that was a weekly dialectal behavioural therapy class. It was a 45-minute drive, and my husband would pick her up, drive her out there and come back for her 3 hours later when the class finished. After the first week of attending the therapy class, she went back to using her own name. Within a few weeks, she stopped taking testosterone. We could see this huge improvement in her. She was coming over once a week for dinner. Our son refused to see her, so he would stay inside the house and we would eat in a back room and watch a movie. She had befriended a lovely French girl who was living in the student accommodation, and she would come around with her and take the dogs for a walk. Then her paternal grandmother died in late August of 2020, and the French girl returned to France, and we noticed that she'd started to bind her breasts again. She told us she'd seen a local plastic surgeon to have the breast cut off. We suddenly had an uneasy feeling and wondered if she could use our private health cover to do this. We rang our health fund and found out that they'd issued a quote to a local private hospital the week before for the surgery. We immediately removed our daughter from our private health fund. We wrote to the plastic surgeon a long letter detailing our daughter's mental health history and our grave concerns, not only for her and her welfare, but for the growing number of young people caught up in what we saw as a social contagion. Our daughter actually gave us permission to speak to the surgeon about her. I asked him, was he cutting the breasts off young women 10 years ago? He sheepishly replied, no. We made it very clear that we did not support our daughter doing this. He made the comment that we were the first parents to object. I know that the two young women our daughter went to drama group with both had their breasts cut off, cheered on by their parents. After speaking to him, we wrote a second letter to him, and I delivered it to him with a copy of Abigail Shrier's book, Irreversible Damage. We also wrote to the private hospital where he operates. We pretty much put them on notice that our daughter was seriously mentally unwell and that we hoped they had procedures in place to ensure patients were able to give consent. We found out that the surgeon called our daughter after that and told her he would not do the surgery. He still advertises for top surgery on his website. I just find it so abhorrent that surgeons are profiteering from the distress of mentally unwell adolescents and young adults. I briefly managed to get our daughter to see another psychiatrist around this time, and knowing that he was gender critical, I had hoped for a miracle. After several sessions with him, she refused to see him again. He did, however, diagnose her with ADHD and being on the autism spectrum as well. The autism spectrum diagnosis really made sense. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. Looking back, I can see that she was always on the periphery of her friendship groups and that she never really felt like she fitted in or that she was like other girls. This clearly became more obvious as she went through her teenage years. Yet of all the health professionals I had taken her to over those 3 years, no one had ever considered autism spectrum. I will just note that the slide that Stella showed common features in ROGD, I could say every one of the features that Stella raised in that slide was our daughter. Sadly, our daughter became more and more alienated from us. We really saw that she had fallen back down the trans rabbit hole, just as we hoped that she was coming out of it. She refused to see us for Christmas 2020, and in January 2021, she told us that she never wanted to see or speak to us again. She moved from the student accommodation and blocked all our numbers. It's now 3 years since she declared she was transgender, and she spent that 3 years on a disability support pension for mental health, not working and not studying. She's attempted study, but withdrawn from every course that she attempted. In 2019 and 2020, I wrote countless letters to the hospital who put her on hormones, to the Australian Medical Association, to our state and federal health ministers, to the Premier, to the Prime Minister, to the Australian Health Ministers Advisory Council, and I was fobbed off every time. We complained to our Healthcare Complaints Commission about our mentally unwell daughter being put on testosterone. They dismissed that complaint. We submitted another complaint about the falsification of our daughter's discharge summary by the hospital, saying that we agreed to the hormone referral when we did not. That complaint was also dismissed, saying they ascertained there was an apparent agreement. I've spent 3 years now reading and researching the enormous spike in young people around the world declaring a transgender identity. I devote sometimes many hours a day to research, reading, and activism. I've been able to recognise the evolution of gender ideology and its nebulous concept of gender identity, heavily promoted by mainstream media and social media as glamorous, brave, stunning, and cool. I have come into contact with so many parents like myself, all gravely concerned about the social contagion that our children have been swept up in and the scale of the harm that is being done by irreversible interventions like hormones and surgeries. I have read far too many heartbreaking stories of regret of young people with maimed and permanently disfigured bodies that they will never be able to return to how they were. The pattern is the same over and over again. Children and young adults who are mentally unwell, perhaps traumatised with histories of bullying or sexual assault, children who are most likely same-sex attracted, children who are on the autism spectrum, neurodiverse children, kids who are misfits or socially awkward. Trans suddenly gives them status and cred, and they become the centre of attention. It is hard to imagine any other medical condition with a serious life-altering treatment where the diagnosis is solely dependent on the reliability and accuracy of a child or young person's self-report. We were supposed to accept, unquestioning, the crazy notion that our female child became a boy overnight at age 17 and therefore needed to alter her body to match some invisible internal identity. It was, to us, an obvious mental health issue. Our daughter had serious mental health issues over that 3-year period prior to her self-diagnosis of transgender. There were serious red flags waving. Those issues, those red flags, were all completely ignored by the medical profession. She has also had another 3 years of poor mental health since, because in their rush to affirm transgender to the complete dismissal of all of her comorbidities, the medical profession has failed to treat her appropriately. Parents understand social contagion among teens. We were teens once as well. Social contagions have always existed. What has changed is now the influence that comes from thousands upon thousands on social media and the misinformation on the internet. There was a cluster of girls in our daughter's drama group who declared that they were transgender. 3 young women, all in the same drama class, suddenly becoming transgender. Surely that alone should have raised red flags with any credible medical practitioner. Yet instead of seeing this social contagion for what it really is, the medical profession have lost sight of the Hippocratic Oath and have accepted the self-diagnosis of these young people. It beggars belief. We all know that puberty is an uncomfortable physical and emotional time for adolescents, yet in order to reach maturity, we have to go through it. Puberty is not a disease, and nor is it optional. It's the only path to our adult selves. To stop this in children is inconceivable. To put a mentally unwell and traumatised teenager on opposite sex hormones is inconceivable. What has also upset me greatly is the role that I've discovered that government-funded organisations like ACON and TransHub in Australia are playing in the grooming of young people. These are organisations similar to Mermaids and Stonewall in the UK. I have found out that ACON have actively encouraged our daughter to undergo a double mastectomy and have given her advice that is, in my opinion, negligent. They told our daughter that top surgery is nothing like a double mastectomy for cancer and that she does not need her unsupportive family because they will help support her. We know that they have actively encouraged her to stay alienated from us. The negative narratives and victimhood that these organisations promote are harmful to the mental health of our children. They have us feel that you can make your own chosen family and discard your true family. The true family who actually love you unconditionally, yet want to keep you from harm. As a mother, I read to my daughter every night for years. I took her to plays, to concerts, to musicals. On holidays, she played sport and took part in many cultural activities. Yet I have been labelled an abusive and unsupportive parent by medical practitioners who really don't even know me. Being a member of parent support groups, both in Australia and internationally, has been crucial to help me get through the grief, shock and horror of the last 3 years. Sadly, it has also opened my eyes to how widespread the harm is and how many families have been completely devastated and broken by gender ideology. Once you know what is actually happening, you can't unknow it. Yet mainstream media refuse to report on this scandal, and most politicians refuse to engage with it. We are truly in a war to save our children from harm. We need to stop the harm now. We are in the midst of an enormous medical scandal. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Jude. That's so moving. I mean, the chat is just cascading with love for you. It really is. I think people are extraordinarily appreciative of you being able to speak with such strength about what's happened to you and with such clarity, and we really, really appreciate it. I just want to read out one comment from my friend Cameron saying, Jude, I'm so glad you finally found your people, how horribly you've been treated, sending love and strength. And that is very typical of, it's still going on, all the hearts there. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
So, hard act to follow, but follow it somebody must. So I'm going to hand over now to Dr. David Bell, who's going to give us a very different perspective with his talk, First, Do No Harm.
Hi, I'll just bring my talk up. I'm still recovering, I think, from the last speaker.
I think a lot of people are, yeah. It's very powerful. I may have got something in my eye, says somebody in the chat.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Jude. I have spoken to and heard from some parents, but never at such length and detail as that. It makes it, I suppose it makes the title of my talk rather fitting, because we've just heard about an avalanche of harm. I mean, I think in some ways we could actually spend the rest of the conference talking about Jude's account in various ways, you know, both in terms of the internal narrative, but also of it being a holder of the more sort of external theoretical concerns that Stella and Lisa are going to talk about. So I did call my paper First, Do No Harm. And as some of you may know, I've been involved in this for about 3 years, a little more now, since I was on the Council of Governors at the Tavistock Clinic, which is I was a staff representative on a sort of parallel governing body. And I think I was known for having concerns about the GID service. And about 10 people, well, first of all, 1, then 2, then 10, which was about a third to a quarter of the whole London service contacted me, some very senior, some junior, all expressing deep concern about the treatment being carried out at that clinic and the damage it was being done to children and the inability to get anybody to listen to them within the trust. And at least 1 or 2 of those therapists was no longer sleeping because they felt they were unwittingly being complicit in causing harm to children. So I'll start just by saying something rather general. All psychiatric disorders occur on the boundary between the individual and culture. That is, there is nothing that is a psychiatric disorder on its own. Everything is embedded within the culture in which it takes place. And some disorders arrive on the scene, rapidly increase as experts and clinics become interested in them and they get DSM diagnoses, and then they wane, and some even disappear, such as false memory syndrome, for example. although the difficulty is that these different syndromes expressed don't disappear, but they're expressed in another form. And I noticed that a number of people in the chat mentioned anorexia, which of course is also related to a hatred of the sexual body. And a number of young women who I've come across who are detransitioners were also anorexic, but no one had made the connection between their anorexia and their relation to their own sexual bodies. What I have to say now will be divided into 3 sections. In the first, I will elaborate on what are on some of the issues of children suffering from gender dysphoria, focusing on the serious clinical and ethical concerns, like I and many others have. I'll then discuss some sociocultural factors that may be relevant, that's work in progress, in trying to understand the huge increase in children and adolescents being referred to specialist services. And lastly, I want to talk about something a bit different, what I call a peculiar form of thinking, or precisely, maybe as Jude has explained to us, non-thinking, that seems to have come to dominate the discourse in this area. Firstly, an important rider, and the fact that I have to do so is symptomatic of the highly charged atmosphere in which discussions of this nature take place, resulting in important and often highly motivated misunderstandings. Questions about the appropriateness of medical and surgical intervention, most particularly in children, are kept, of course, entirely distinct from questions of discrimination. I say this as there is a pressure for these 2 matters to be elided, which I'll return to later. We're all appalled if any trans person is treated violently or inhumanly or discriminated against. And indeed, many of us, in particular maybe the psychotherapists and psychoanalysts, may have thoughts about what it is that arouses that kind of hatred. Concerns regarding the understanding and treatment of children with gender dysphoria. Some of the things I say here have to some extent been said, but I'm saying them slightly differently. So the first thing to say is that the very word transgender is a useless term, because it covers a multitude of different kinds of thing, as I hope we will discuss. And it's very important to differentiate gender dysphoria from transgender. The former then, gender dysphoria, refers to deep feelings of discomfort with the sexual body, which has multiple sources and multiple therapeutic approaches. For example, one can think, as I will talk about shortly, issues to do with sexuality, various comorbid conditions, autogynephilia. Autogynephilia refers to a male sexual activity where a man likes to will dress up as a woman and masturbate in a mirror, being very excited by the appearance of himself as a woman. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that at all, if that's what someone does in private. However, there was a sort of, some of the people suffering from autogynephilia then moved in to become part, were drawn into the transgender movement. So that's another sort of route. Transgender refers to those individuals who have completed or are embarking on medical and surgical intervention aimed at altering their sexual bodies. However, services pressured by trans ideological lobbies, by an increasingly hegemonic zeitgeist, fail to discriminate between the two, that is, gender dysphoria and transgender, with disastrous consequences. Now, there are multiple routes to gender dysphoria, and the list is long, but would include the following: the presence of various psychological disorders. And that reminds me something from your paper, Stella, that you showed figures for suicide, and in the bar chart, one of them was for gender dysphoria. But I just thought probably that bar itself doesn't make sense unless there was some way of differentiating gender dysphoria from other comorbid conditions. That is, in the discussions of suicide and suicidality, if someone has gender dysphoria, they often have many other disorders as well. But the thing that gets recorded in these online surveys is just the gender dysphoria or the transgender, not the comorbidities. So that it's a very false way of representing things. So various psychological disorders, including depression, autism, of course, children who, for multiple and complex reasons, live a lonely and isolated life, feeling they have no place in the world, are psychically lost and homeless. Serious family disturbances common, often with intergenerational transmission of major trauma, such as child abuse in the mother or the maternal line. This is sometimes a source of the mother not wanting a girl child, something that can be conveyed consciously, but often much less consciously to the child. The girl child picks up the mother's discomfort with the girl's sexual body. Some families have suffered other major traumas. For example, families where there's been, say, the death of, say, a female child. And then the dead child's brother suddenly presents as being trans, as being a girl. But what's extraordinary about that is the lack of interrogation of what would be obvious to any first-year psychologist. You know, is this child identified with the dead child? And is, so to speak, he trying to give the parents back their daughter? Any family therapist would think of that immediately. A very important causal root, well described in the literature, is related to homosexuality. It is not uncommon for a lesbian girl, for example, to think that because she's attracted to same sex, she must, in inverted commas, really be a boy. Some children who show characteristics of being gay or lesbian find this is not tolerated by the family, sometimes overtly, but equally often in more subtle, even unconscious ways. And one of the characteristics of this whole area, and what is quite disturbing that should be happening at the Tavistock, is a superficiality. That is, I said, subtle and unconscious ways. There's a focus on very, very superficial surface phenomena and lack of probing underneath, which of course, somewhere like the Tavistock it's very bread and butter. The children also internalize this intolerance of their sexual orientation, which again becomes manifest as hatred of their own sexual bodies. Stella said something related to this, and maybe I just put it in a more slightly psychoanalytic way. That is, it's common, it's not universal, but it's very common for girls to become very disturbed in puberty. And one of the ways of thinking about this is that a girl pre-puberty, when she has thoughts about sex and sexuality, may project them into the mother and think of all that disgusting thing that the parents do or the mother's involved with, how filthy and disgusting. And that's in a way defensive and helpful. But then as she enters puberty and sees breasts growing and her body changing, at an unconscious level, that can be experienced as mother's entered her body, that she's losing control of her body. Some alien force identified perhaps with mother has got inside her and becomes a source of great distress and hatred. And a lot of girls have to manage that in various ways, some more successfully than others, but many women I've talked to recognize that. And many studies have shown that a lot of these children will be helped if they're looked after in a proper manner, end up being gay or lesbian without undergoing transition and being gender non-conforming. This also illustrates the way that gender as a category has come to obscure discussion of sexuality and the materiality of biological sex. It was very strange when I did my report of the Tavistock Jude service and talked the clinicians that I talked to. They said what was quite extraordinary was that sexuality was never mentioned, only gender. Very odd for a place such as the Tavistock to ignore sexuality. A further issue here, one of considerable importance, is that many young people who are unwilling or unable, and this is what Stella was saying, to conform to gender stereotypes, for example, a girl wishing to be more masculine, are misunderstood as being transgender. Here, medical intervention supports not fluidity but a rigid binary construction of gender that has a caricaturistic quality. That is, if you don't like, pink ribbons and dollies, you're not really a girl. The massive increase in referrals, which Stella's already showed us, of children and adolescents to the Tavistock, so is JIS. I won't show the bar chart again because you've shown it, but basically it goes from 80 to 2,800 over a period of about 9 years. This massive increase has caused many, has many sources, which I'll discuss in a moment. But the staff who came to me were very concerned about very particular things. For example, the recruitment of staff with very low levels of clinical knowledge and skill, particularly as regards complex disorders in childhood and adolescence. Because of the huge numbers, the need to sort of cut to limit the budget by recruiting lower level staff. Many of those staff had had little or no previous exposure to complex serious disorders in childhood. Other issues that were raised were huge caseloads, perhaps over 100, 140, some mentioned. One psychotherapist said that, family therapist told me that in his previous job, where he'd seen hundreds of children over the years, if you just said one thing, like the one whose father was a cab driver and died suddenly, he said, I really remember everything about that kid. But these kids, he said, he can't remember anything because the service felt much more like all the children were the same because it all came with a script and the script wasn't sufficiently interrogated. So it all became one kind of blur. They thought there were unresolved serious ethical issues of what constitutes informed consent in minors. We could discuss that maybe more later. The risks to young children and adolescents of hormonal and surgical interventions without adequate assessment or time or thinking space. None of the adolescents underwent surgery until they were adult, but there are many kids who start on the waiting list as adolescents, but by the time they get near to being seen, they're 18 and sent to the adult service, but there's virtually no psychological scrutiny at all. This is all particularly important given the lack of any evidence for safety of the medication, and given now that 98% of pubertal children progress from so-called puberty blockers to opposite sex hormones. And thus, starting them on puberty blockers is putting them on the road to opposite sex hormones and to surgery. Services submit, indeed encourage submission to powerful politicized lobbies who often are very closely involved in the service, such as Mermaids and Stonewall. And the staff had a great fear of being called transphobic. This closed down space for thought, doubt, and exploration. Many staff, there were staff who were taken off cases because they were worried that the child was gay, and they were told that they were just causing difficulties and were taken off the case. Some workers have emphasized to me the problem of guilt in the parents. I think this is quite an interesting one. That is, whenever a child is disturbed, it is inevitable that parents feel guilty, of course. Very painful business, often excessively so, very often. However, if the child announces they are trans, and the implication is that this is a biological rather than a psychological issue, then parents in some cases will feel relieved of guilt. Not everyone has Jude's strength. Such parents may actively campaign for the child to transition very quickly, saying they want closure here, and are often very intransigent if any doubts are raised. The implication here is that if the child is not trans, if the problem is, so to speak, elsewhere, the parents are again faced with what may be unbearable guilt. On the other hand, there are parents who express doubt and reluctant to proceed quickly, as Jude has discussed, and are often threatened or marginalized in the ways that she has described. Thus, while it is clear that we are dealing with a highly complex problem with many causal pathways and no single causative factor, gender services tend towards a very damaging, peculiar, superficial simplification. For various reasons, not least a huge increase in caseloads, the long waiting lists, leading to pressures to process the children using a procedural model rather than one aimed at understanding the individual case in any depth. The great problem of the Tavistock service is it's a gateway, rather than being separate, it's a gateway to puberty blockers. Of course, alignment with affirmative lobbies, that is lobbies that seek to affirm the wish to change gender, tending to see it only as a positive choice to be encouraged, acts as an ideological support for this simplification. Many services lack any understanding of and are overtly hostile to any thought about the less manifest, less conscious issues in ways that are not, in which ways that they are not for other disorders. So trans is somehow exceptionalized. Even thinking about cause is very often regarded as an act of hostility. For the only acceptable explanation is that the child is literally in the wrong body. And all suffering is secondary to this, in inverted commas, fact. It needs to be borne in mind there's absolutely no evidence at all for this assertion. It's a kind of belief, it's a kind of essentialist belief in some kind of gendered soul. Even mermaids have stopped using that term. We also need to distinguish a child's subjective account from a more external perspective. Patient involvement in decision-making is, of course, a good thing, but that needs to be distinguished from the non-questioning of the patient's account. When it becomes non-questioning, here we see a perversion of clinical care into a kind of customership, where the customer is always right. And this is perversely championed as patient engagement. Some guidelines accept that if a child is disturbed by being trans, then they do need psychological help, with the implication, most peculiar, that if they are not disturbed, there's no need for help. In fact, one could argue the exact opposite. Non-disturbance is more likely a sign of dissociation from the implications of pursuing transition. There's also a tendency, which I think Jude has helped us with, and also Stella's paper, to sanitize interventions, which are presented, discussed in such a way as to downplay their nature and the lifelong implications, being a patient for the rest of your life, anorgasmia, infertility. Sometimes it's even made to sound like minor cosmetic surgery, sometimes referred to as top surgery, as opposed to double mastectomy. I recently just heard of a Scottish 16-year-old child who's had a double mastectomy. I and many colleagues have seen adult patients where genital surgery has resulted in, apart from the inevitable complications, further complications because of the surgery going wrong. A number of surgeons are now expressing very serious doubt and concern, as if they're suddenly waking up to what's happened. We've mentioned the geometric increase in referrals, but I would like to draw attention to the rising number of natal females, which is a relatively new phenomenon. It must, I think, be clear that such a rapid escalation of cases, the increase in natal females, the sudden appearance of so-called rapid onset gender dysphoria, cannot be explained by individual factors alone. Nor is it likely to be caused by a large number of individuals feeling at last free to come out in this new liberal atmosphere. It must be derived from sociocultural forces that are as yet poorly understood or even investigated, as we're going to hear from Lisa shortly. It is therefore regrettable that treatment for children and adolescents that has been increasing exponentially without inquiry is being treated without inquiry into this broader determining sociocultural context, where we have no real knowledge of the consequences and no adequate follow-up data. What I offer now is a preliminary sketch of some of the factors that may be relevant to these sudden changes. Now I'm going to see if I can share my screen now and bring these factors up. I'll have a go. I'll just leave that up for a moment for you to see, and then I'll take it down again because I'm going to go through them. But those are some of the factors, if you like, a kind of perfect storm. I'll take that down now because I can't have that up at the same time and also read my paper. So I'll stop share. Okay, so first of all, the ever-increasing penetration of the market form into all aspects of life reaches deeply into the psychology of the person, where identity becomes reformulated. Identity comes to manifest features of the commodity form. It moves from being something that one lives with or struggles with over time to a more transient structure, which, somewhat like a commodity, is exchangeable. Commodity exchange, because of its extraordinary rapidity, supports the illusion of instantaneous transformation. It should be clear here that I do not mean that a trans person just chooses a new identity without painful struggle, of course not, but only that this underlying sociocultural change acts as a tendential force influencing the way we all think. This transformation is increasingly expressed in the relation between doctors and patients, which degenerates, as I mentioned above, into its perverse form, a celebration of customerhood, misunderstood as democratization. The distinction between need and wish here evaporates. We've been used to a world where a patient requests such and such a treatment, but the professional does not agree, introducing a triangulation that may be welcomed or resisted. However, powerful social forces misrepresent this triangulation as only representing a kind of patriarchal power play. And where this is successful, externality collapses. An analytic patient of mine who mixed in circles, a young man who mixed in circles who didn't know much about psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. One of his friends asked him what psychoanalysis was. And he said, and I was very touched by this, it's like having someone on your side, but not someone siding with you. That's an entirely different matter. And maybe that's an answer to one of the things that came up in the chat about kindness. Siding with someone is not an act of kindness. An act of kindness is to be able to hold a neutral position, a sympathetic position, and maintain that neutrality, which is costly and difficult, but it's an act of kindness. Another major factor was overburdened child mental health services in the UK who cannot cope with the combination of increased demand and cutting of resources, are stretched to breaking point. Faced with children suffering complex serious disorders, it is understandable that any mention of gender problems can quickly result in a referral to specialist gender services. And in the process, the other disorders are now filtered through the prism of gender, and they can be left completely unaddressed. This can lead to a damaging foreclosure of the ordinary serious disturbance and turbulence and confusions of adolescence. Another change which is perhaps important is transformation in political life, so that identity politics has moved much more into the center. This movement, which certainly starts off life as liberal and emancipatory, can sometimes go through twists and turns and then comes to manifest the very characteristics it sought to challenge. It becomes fixed, narrow, all-determining, all critical engagement recast as an enemy to be silenced. Then there's the increasing recourse to medical and surgical intervention. Particularly is true whole loads of stuff online about particularly girls having various surgical interventions to convert their bodies into a kind of sex stereotype. So this increasing medical and surgical intervention enacts a breakdown in the boundary between bodily self and technology. Lastly, I think that in our current conjuncture, we are witnessing a growing misogyny. What I have in mind here is this: since the Second World War, up until the late 70s, a strong femininity was expressed, at least in the UK, by the increasing theorization and respect for maternal caring. And in the UK situation, the creation of the welfare state maintained a certain social dominance. However, that version of strong caring has been represented in its perverse form, nanny state, a contemptuous attack on femininity. This is both expressed and reinforced by ideological forms that promote the delusion of autonomous man seeking only to service his own needs, enacting a hatred of all forms of dependence. This growing misogyny may have very profound effects upon girls, and in conjunction with more individual factors, supports the internalization of this hatred of femininity, transformed into hatred of their female bodies. And then lastly, the internet and social media, which Lisa Littman has discussed a lot. So I don't think I'll mention that because I think that's already well described. The last bit of my paper I call a peculiar mode of thinking. I'll here elaborate on some aspects of what I call a peculiar form of thinking that has come to dominate this discourse. As I've already made clear, thoughtful engagement is treated as a kind of enemy, and this is certainly the experience of many clinicians working in gender services. The wish to think over time and understand why this particular child has developed in this particular way comes to be seen as an expression of transphobia. This creates a paranoid universe, a world where you are either with me or against me. That is, there is no room for a mind that just wants to think about things. This intolerance of doubt and thought that characterize certain kinds of the intolerance of doubt and thought that characterizes certain kinds of mental state here leaks out and becomes a force in the social realm. The term transphobia has for many in mental health services, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, a particular unfortunate resonance, named the homophobia that is a part of our history. I have in mind that dark history of conversion therapies for homosexuals, particularly, though not only in the USA. I believe the fear of repeating this has interfered with our capacity to think through these issues and has led us to turning a blind eye. But it is vital to distinguish between conversion therapy and a wish to think. As I see it, the rapid decisions as regards the provision of medical and surgical intervention is itself a form of conversion therapy. Like the past so-called treatments for homosexuality, it seeks to refashion the body as the only permissible solution to painful conflicts about gender. It brings about transformations in the body, converting it in order to satisfy insufficiently examined individual, family, and social agendas. Lastly, the possession of a particular identity is taken as supplying an individual with a peculiar kind of higher authority. If, for example, a person says, as a gay man, or as a Jewish man, or a disabled person, or a Black person, or whatever, it would be quite reasonable to accept that such a person, because of their specific experiences, will enrich any discussion of the world with which they identify. But this does not bring entitlement to an unquestioned higher authority. That is, by belonging to X group or Y group, my views as to what is true about the world, particularly about the group to which I belong, remains as open to doubt and question as the views of any other person. This assumed higher authority, exceptionalism, exhibits also a kind of entitlement that can in part be derived from the link between a particular identity and victimhood. That is, an entitlement not to be questioned. That is, a demand to be exempt from the ordinary canons as to what counts as good judgment. There can be no personal or group sovereignty as to what counts as true. This is here, I believe, there is here, I think, a link to the attack on truth value that is so characteristic of our age. One wonders if the peculiar intransigence of these beliefs is at times a result of the awareness of doubt, doubt that is disowned and projected into the other, who then must be silenced. If we take it as a fact that gender identity is socially constructed, or largely socially constructed, then there is a paradox at the heart of this phenomenon. The apparent freedom or liberation that it expresses is totally undermined by locating all possibility of change only concretely in the material alteration of the body rather than the mind. There's been a peculiar regression in thinking. In our contemporary world, we are generally more tolerant, even celebrate a certain gender fluidity in terms of gender and sexuality. We, at least I suppose in urban areas, are less interested in who a person goes to bed with, less bothered by a man being somewhat effeminate or a woman being somewhat unfeminine. But this exists alongside a toleration of certain limitations arising from the body. But in the ideology of the militant trans lobbies, there's a peculiar rigidity of gender identity, coupled with a belief in the total fluidity of the body, a most peculiar reversal. This is coupled with a peculiar essentialist mode of thought, that is, gender identity is confused with anatomical sex, and so is seen as biological and fixed rather than psychological, social, and fluid. B. Campbell, a well-known British writer and feminist, wrote, "The sexual revolution wrought by a feminist and gay activism has, of course, changed the political landscape in which trans lives can be lived. It coexists with the commodification of gender archetypes and the reinstatement of a seemingly polarized and parodic masculinity and femininity." Here I've described how thinking becomes the enemy to be destroyed. Nothing should stand in the way of an unobstructed pathway to irreversible medical and then surgical procedures that result in lifetime medication where we do not know what the consequences are. I will end with a story. As a medical student, I attended a lecture by Hans Eysenck on his electric shock treatment to decondition gay men. In the discussion, a young gay philosopher, as I later learned when I spoke to him, asked if there were not any ethical matters that needed consideration. Eysenck responded that these men were suffering as a result of being homosexual and sought help. We have, he said, the technology to relieve them. There needs to be no further ethical consideration. The questioner suggested a thought experiment. He said, "Let us just imagine for a moment, Professor Eysenck, that you are an orthopedic surgeon, and that one day a man approaches you complaining, 'I cannot bear my arm. It is ugly. I never know what to do with it. My wife also hates it. I don't know where to put it in bed. Look, it's covered in bruises. I'm always knocking it. Would you just please remove my arm?' 'Well,' said the questioner, 'I think you might, Professor Eysenck, send him to a psychiatrist to find out what is, and say to him there's something wrong in the relation between the man and his arm. You would not, I think, say we have the technology to relieve him of his suffering and so proceed to amputation.' There was a deafening silence in the room. The point here is, of course, is the homosexual man who seeks treatment of this type is not sovereign over decisions as to what afflicts him. For there would be individual, family, and social determinations, including for that, such a man living in a world where hatred of homosexuality would be a daily experience. Things that would affect him beyond awareness. However, the last time I told that story, I was disturbed to learn that in the USA, there are surgeons who will amputate under these conditions. Here, patienthood has collapsed completely into customership, and so wish transcends any conception of need, and externality is annihilated. It is indeed strange to be living in a world where, when I was working at the Tavistock, I received a referral from a plastic surgeon of a man who asked for surgery on his nose. The surgeon had met this man a number of times. He decided there was nothing wrong with his nose, but there was something wrong with his relationship with his nose. After a year's psychotherapy, the man discovered or didn't discover, but more recognized the centrality of the hatred of his father in his life, particularly in relation to some very early traumatic experiences, and understood that his nose was like his father's. He gave up his wish for plastic surgery. Meanwhile, a person with acute gender dysphoria, with only a few consultations, may well find agreement to change her name, commence medication, and be heading for surgical removal of her breasts and genitals. Any questioning foreclosed. It needs to be emphasized here that when someone starts on puberty blockers, for which, as I said, there is no evidence of, we do not know what the effects are. There's certainly very strong evidence of effects on bone, effects on cognitive development, effects on brain development. But also originally when they were being used in this context, there was an idea of an interregnum, that they would delay puberty. But here, even that is not the case, because 98% go on to opposite sex hormones. This means that starting a patient on puberty blockers has all the weight on it in terms of consent, of starting them on a pathway which may well be irreversible. Many years ago, when I was young, so not many of you will know this, but if your television didn't work, you might get some wavy lines on it. And you would twiddle one of the knobs to sort of change it so that the lines disappeared. But sometimes you get a message from the broadcaster: do not adjust your set. There's a problem with the signal. A version of this made its way into a popular political slogan: do not adjust your set. Reality is disturbed. However, the current predicament is so much darker, as Jude, in fact, has particularly showed us. Serious questions have been raised concerning the ethics and safety of these so-called medical and surgical treatments, which are offering surgical and medical solutions to psychological problems. It is to be hoped that this discussion is part of a critical engagement. There's now a much broader debate in the media and than would have been possible only a few years ago. So maybe the pendulum may be swinging a bit the other way. But there are many beleaguered colleagues who are struggling to maintain thought and ethical responsibility, and they need our support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bell. That was really thought-provoking. I'm seeing lots of people putting comments along the lines of, I think I need to go away and think about that over and over again. We'll move on now to our final speaker, Dr. Lisa Littman.
Hi, thanks for having me. I think this has been a wonderful event. The speakers have been great, and it's really tough to follow all the speakers that came before me. And thanks to the audience for sticking around. It's been about 2 hours that we've all been together. So I am going to start by talking about gender dysphoria and psychosocial factors. And many of you may be familiar with my work, and some people may have signed on because they like the research, and some maybe because they hate the research. And just wanted to mention again, as others had, that this is a controversial topic. All right, so I thought I would start by sharing my values and where I'm coming from, and what, which values are really relevant to the work that I do. So first, I am pro-LGBT, and I support LGBT people and rights. And I am pro-prioritizing the health and well-being of all people who experience gender dysphoria. And by this, I mean people who have been helped by transition and people who have been harmed by transition. People who have had gender dysphoria that persisted, people who had gender dysphoria that desisted, people who had underlying conditions for their gender dysphoria, and those who had not. And then the final thing I will mention here is that I am pro asking research questions to better understand a condition. So we've talked a bit about rapid onset gender dysphoria. And I'm just going to talk about as well the term ROGD, as well as the hypotheses that were generated from my research. So when I started to explore this topic, I needed a term to use when talking about it, when writing about it. And so I coined the term Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria as a descriptive term to describe a phenomenon where teens and young adults who lacked observable signs of gender dysphoria or gender incongruence during their childhood became gender dysphoric or transgender identified during or after puberty. And so I didn't have to say ROGD. Other people don't have to use the term ROGD. Some might say late onset gender dysphoria in adolescents and young adults. You know, a rose has many names, or a rose by any other name. So it is not a formal diagnosis. The research on this topic is very early. And so I'm just pointing that out there. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are organizations who are strongly opposed to using the term ROGD and are opposed to the concept of ROGD. So what is this hypothesis that I'm talking about? Psychosocial factors in gender dysphoria. And so these I might call the ROGD hypotheses that came from my research. And broadly stated, they are that psychosocial factors such as social influence, maladaptive coping mechanisms, internalized homophobia, trauma, and mental health conditions can cause or contribute to the development of gender dysphoria in some individuals. The reason I've underlined some, and I'm going to point out that it's very, very obvious, but some does not mean all, and some does not mean none. So my research does not apply to all people who have gender dysphoria, and it should not be used to imply that everyone who is gender dysphoric had this kind of experience. My research is one piece of the puzzle in figuring out this topic. So I have little puzzle pieces here. So for example, talking about ROGD, maybe one piece, other people may not have these experiences. And so this does not disprove one or the other. So just in a little bit less polarized example, if I were studying type 2 diabetes, then I would not be implying that everybody has type 2 diabetes. And related to that, if somebody else is studying or finds that individuals have type 1 diabetes, that does not disprove all of the research about type 2 diabetes. You know, all of these areas, all of these experiences, all of this research really are parts of the bigger picture. So why is this so controversial? And I have to say, I have been thinking long and hard about this topic, starting from, let's say, the day after my study was published. So this is why I think it's controversial. So currently there is a public debate, there's clinical debate, and I believe people are basically arguing from the positions of two conceptual models for gender dysphoria. And so I'm going to talk right now about a developmental model for gender dysphoria and an innate gender identity model, which you might call gender theory, you might call a gender affirmative model. So from a developmental model, gender dysphoria is may develop in the context of different kinds of cognitive, psychological, social, relationship processes. And the context is important because what you would do to help that patient is different. So for example, someone may become gender dysphoric because they are a young boy who is being bullied for liking ballet dancing, or a teenager who is discovering that she is same-sex attracted and having difficulty accepting herself as lesbian. Gender dysphoria might emerge after the trauma of a rape, and gender dysphoria might emerge in the absence of all of those things. And so the context is important, because you would not treat somebody who develops gender dysphoria right after being raped the same way as you would somebody who's had gender dysphoria without any issues. So this is really viewed, gender dysphoria, as something that can have multiple causes, multiple treatments. Now, we don't have clear-cut causes, but just, I'm speaking conceptually. So context is important. Psychological issues, if they coexist with gender dysphoria, could possibly be underlying conditions for gender dysphoria. And I'm talking about the developmental model of gender dysphoria. From the developmental perspective, the desistance research is acknowledged within the strengths and limitations of the research. And as you would imagine, approaches really employ a thorough evaluation. So approaches that are consistent with the developmental model are a developmentally informed biopsychosocial approach, a systems approach, an exploratory approach. And these employ thorough evaluation and a judicious use of medical and surgical transition. So in contrast, there is the innate gender identity model. And this is more of a one cause, one treatment belief. So in this model, it's believed that there is an entity called a gender identity that represents a person's true self. And this gender identity may either match or not match one's biological body. And this is the source of gender dysphoria. And the treatment for this is transition. And because this is more simplified, the context is really not important. Psychological issues are thought not to be underlying conditions. And I'm just going to point out that's really more in practice than what's written. So the way it's written is that psychological issues are unlikely to be underlying, or so, if you're thinking about psychological issues, the direction of, you can think that gender dysphoria might cause psychological issues, such as from discrimination and poor treatment, or that psychological issues may be completely unrelated, or you can conceptualize psychological issues as underlying. And so in practice, the suggestion of underlying conditions is often met with hostility and calls that's transphobic. So this is the more extreme version. The desistance research in the innate gender identity model is rejected. And these approaches are approaches that have minimal or even absent evaluation and liberal use of transition. So the informed consent model requires no mental health evaluation before accessing transition. And this is for individuals 18 and older. And it's popular in the United States right now. And I do need to point out that the gender identity affirmative approach, there are people having a debate within this about what is the role of the evaluation, because recently 3 very prominent members of WPATH have spoken out and saying that they are concerned about the lack of evaluation because there is a trend of clinicians bypassing or considering that the affirmative model means that individuals don't need an evaluation. So in other words, to say it more succinctly, the priorities for a developmental model are making the correct diagnosis and providing the correct treatment. And from the innate gender identity model, the priority really is quick access to transition. And people in both of these models believe that what they're doing is helping people, but you can understand why there would be a clash of priorities, because the folks from the innate gender identity model will view developmental model as being an unnecessary delay to transition. Transition is believed to be the answer, and delay is seen as harmful. Coming from the developmental model, there is concern that this quick access to transition is failing to diagnose important conditions and providing the wrong treatment to some individuals. So the reason that I believe the developmental model is superior is because there are a lot of outcomes for gender dysphoria and transition. And we know people who have all of, who could be categorized in each of these. And we have research that describes these different outcomes. And so the developmental model accommodates all of these outcomes. Oh, whoops, I'm going to go back. So I just wanted to say, as everybody probably knows, so gender dysphoria may persist, it may desist. Someone may be satisfied with transition. They may only detransition because they are discriminated against, and they might detransition and not regret their transition. But there are people who are dissatisfied with their transitions, who detransition and regret that transition. So moving on, the innate gender identity model, in contrast, only accommodates some of these outcomes. So yeah, so you can see where this information and these individuals and research about these topics challenge this model. And so what I've seen is that there are some behaviors that I think raise some concerns that people might be coming a little ideological around this topic in this quick transition approach, because typically, you would use data to inform your model and not take the model and take your approach to decide to reject data and people. So, we've seen individuals and groups that deny desisters or really try and discredit detransitioners who regret transition. And we've seen some double standards applied to research. And so personally, I don't think that this approach is compassionate to the people who have these experiences that are not consistent with the affirmative model. And I don't think it's scientific to do so. So in a nutshell, why do I think that my work is so controversial? After thinking long and hard, I think it's because my research it challenges the model and the approach to quick transition. So anyway, so that's really the context, I think. And so switching gears, why did I start to research gender dysphoria? I've talked about this previously, but I noticed in my own community around 2014 that one after the next teenager was starting to identify as transgender, and in numbers much greater than I would expect to see. And these kids turned out to be all from the same friendship group. And so that didn't make sense given what we know about gender dysphoria. Next, I reviewed the scientific literature, finding that, what I'm seeing is not explained by the scientific literature at that point. I reviewed the social media on the topic. I found that teenagers were asking about symptoms and experiences and saying, does this mean I'm trans? They were being told yes, and you should transition right away. And there was a lot of information on social media about how to trick your doctors to get hormones, how to trick your parents to get you there. And then I searched online to see if anybody else was reporting this. Okay, so globally, there was a lot going on. Starting in 2015 is when gender clinics, specialty gender clinics in Canada and the Netherlands started to publish about their patient demographics. And they noticed that maybe starting in the mid 2000s, that there was an uptick and a really, really pronounced increase in teenagers seeking care, and an even sharper increase in female teens seeking care. So much so that the sex ratio switched from a population that was predominantly male to one that was predominantly female. Around this time, there started to be recognition of a new type of presentation of gender dysphoria that prior to 2012, late onset gender dysphoria in natal females was relatively absent from the scientific literature. And so this started to be observed more and more. Research coming out of the clinics in Finland and also the United Kingdom showed that teens seeking care had higher psychological and developmental problems. In Finland, they describe perhaps there are additional pathways based on what they are seeing in their patients. And so there has been a tremendous change in the demographics and presentations of patients that occurred rather recently. So why are these changes happening? And so some of the authors of the research documenting these changes suggested some explanations. So could this be decreased stigma, increased visibility and information? And sure, those things would definitely explain increase in numbers, but it doesn't explain why teens in particular, why there's been a change in the sex ratio, and why there is this new presentation, late onset gender dysphoria in natal females. Another proposed explanation is maybe there are sex-based differences in stigma. So if it's harder for males to come out as trans than females, you would see an increase in females. But this doesn't explain why there's a new presentation, why this change in sex ratio was not seen for adults. This seems to be something that is occurring in young people. And so this has really not been researched yet, even though some people will dig in their heels and say, oh, it is definitely stigma, increased visibility and information, and absolutely nothing else. That's really an overstatement because we don't know yet. And so given that we don't have an explanation that describes all of these changes, and with such big changes, it really could be many different factors contributing to this. Why explore psychosocial factors? So Stella had already mentioned social contagion, peer contagion. Humans are susceptible to being influenced by other human beings in a variety of ways. Adolescents are particularly susceptible to peer influence. And because the driving force of these changes are adolescents seeking care, I think it's important to explore this. There are differences for peer contagion. Female teens are more susceptible to anxiety, depression, disordered eating, and body image issues, while male teens are more susceptible to risk-taking behaviors. Another thing is the pattern of distribution, clusters of individuals announcing a trans identity, the social media content and the dynamics, and the psychological issues. Basically, it would have been irresponsible not to explore psychosocial factors. So I'm going to talk about how I looked into psychosocial factors through the course of 3 different studies. The first study was a study of parents about their gender dysphoric youth. And these parents were recruited from parent support websites as well as snowball sampling. The second study was a study of detransitioners, and they were from the age of 18 to the age of over 60. They were recruited from various sources with efforts to reach communities with different views on transition and detransition. And the third study is a study of desisters and detransitioners aged 18 to 33. And this last one is not an anonymous study. Each of the individuals were screened by video conference. So the third one is not published yet, but the first 2 they are open access. I am just going to gloss over just the portion that's relevant to this talk. Just wanted to say that. So the purpose of the first one was to collect data about parents' observations of their children who seemed to show signs of a sudden or rapid onset of gender dysphoria that began during or after puberty, and to generate some hypotheses about potential contributions to all of these recent changes. The methods I used were methods that have been in existence for decades: descriptive, exploratory, and online anonymous survey, parent report. Somehow none of these methods have caused outrage until, let's say, 2018. And I recruited by placing information on parent support websites and snowball sampling, which resulted in a 4th parent support site sharing information about the study. And parents were eligible if their child, if they observed that their child had gender dysphoria that began during or after puberty. So there were 256 participants who were mostly female, mostly from the US, but also from the UK, Canada, and elsewhere, mostly white, mostly supported lesbian, gay, and gay rights to legal marriage, and supported the belief that transgender people deserve the same rights as others. The youth described were mostly female, and their mean ages were 14 years of age when their first friend announced a transgender identification, 15 years of age when they announced a transgender identification, and 16 years of age when their parent completed a survey. And 87% of the youth described belonged to a friend group where one or multiple friends became transgender identified in a similar time frame, had an increase in social media use, or both. Based on parent report, none would have met diagnosis for childhood gender dysphoria. And actually, that was an exclusionary factor, that if somebody did, then they were not part of this study, because this is what the focus of the study was. So Stella talked about this a bit. The youth were vulnerable prior to the onset of their gender dysphoria, and they had the belief that transition would solve their problems. I asked parents about the friendship groups and how many friends that were part of the pre-existing friendship group became trans identified. And so the mean number was 3.5, and which ranged from 2 friends becoming trans identified to 10 friends becoming trans identified. I also asked whether the majority of the group became trans identified, and in more than a third that was the case. Here we go. So, so I saw some very interesting group dynamics, that a substantial number of parents reported that within the friendship group, the friends actively mocked people who were not trans or LGBT, and that when their kid announced that they were trans identified, their popularity increased. So parents really provided a lot of rich information describing the type of mocking that these kids engaged in. So I have a few quotes. If they aren't mocking cis people, they're playing pronoun police and mocking people who can't get the pronouns correct. New vocabulary includes cis stupid and cis stupidity. And on the bottom right, this is a really interesting 2 cases that illustrate the power of peers. There were 2 individuals, unrelated, who became trans identified within their peer groups in high school, had plans to transition the next academic year. Both of these individuals spent the summer away doing something fun, not with their friend group, didn't have access to social media. They made new friends, they had romantic relationships. During that time, they discovered or came to the conclusion that they were not transgender after all. So these kids returned home and were so concerned about facing their friend group that they previously belonged to tell them that they weren't transgender identified, that they asked their parents to help them transfer high schools, and so that they wouldn't have to face the original friend group. And both of these parents were able to do so, and described that these kids were thriving in their new environments. So here's the quote. She thought that none of her friends would understand, and they'd think she was a fraud. She wanted to get out of the culture that if you are cis, then you are bad or oppressive or clueless. She was vehement about wanting to get out of the whole scene. So I asked what kind of social media advice these kids had been exposed to, and these are the responses. How to tell if they are transgender, reasons why they should transition right away, that if parents didn't agree to take them for hormones, that they're abusive and transphobic, what to say to a doctor to get hormones faster, that they should use the suicide narrative to convince their parents, and that it's acceptable to lie to doctors to get hormones faster. So spoiler alert, the detransitioners also saw that kind of advice online. So parents were asked what they think were the most influential sources for their child becoming gender dysphoric. And these sources were YouTube transition videos, Tumblr, in-person friends, online communities. And here are just a few quotes from parents. "We feel she was highly influenced by the, if you are even questioning your gender, you are probably transgender." And this other parent reported that there was an online world at the ready to tell her that very normal feelings meant she's in the wrong body. So there were a couple of interesting subgroups, individuals 34 who experienced a sex or gender related trauma shortly before becoming gender dysphoric, 30 youth whose transgender identification seemed to arise in the context of severe psychiatric symptoms, and 8 individuals who, as they assumed a transgender identification, their mental well-being, as reported by their parents, worsened. And then as they dropped the transgender identification, their mental well-being improved. So the hypotheses generated were that this may represent a new development of late onset gender dysphoria, a new developmental pathway, that social influences can contribute to the development of gender dysphoria, and that maladaptive coping mechanisms may underlie the development of gender dysphoria. So one of my colleagues has said the following, which I think really captures the big picture. So this is from Dr. Roberto D'Angelo. "I think that with some ROGD, the individual is already struggling and unhappy due to other issues, and trans is appropriated as a solution to their difficulties. People I've seen often have a fantasy that transitioning would make them into a new person, free of all the old difficulties. I think the social contagion aspect may relate to the availability of the trans narrative as a compelling solution to pain and distress." So the conclusions really are that more research needs to be conducted, that these are emerging hypotheses, and the limitations are the same limitations that are inherent with these methods, even when they're used in research with different conclusions. But parent report, targeted recruitment, convenient samples, anonymous surveys, and cross-sectional research have limitations. So more research is needed, and these hypotheses need to be explored by firsthand accounts of people who experience the gender dysphoria. So the second study is a study of individuals who detransitioned. And for this, I define detransition as having transitioned with medical or surgical methods, and detransition by stopping the medications or having surgery to reduce the changes. And so this is a similar method. However, I collaborated with 2 individuals with personal experience of detransitioning. And this was hugely, hugely helpful to ensure that the survey was clear, that it was relevant to a variety of experiences with detransition, and in helping with the recruitment. And so for this recruitment, we reached out to communities that might favor a quick approach to transition, such as the WPATH listserv, APA, as well as to communities that may not believe that transition is universally beneficial to everybody, like the DTrans forums, or actually Facebook groups at that time. So going on, here are my participants. There were 100 individuals age 18 to over 60. They were predominantly female from the US, UK, Canada, Australia, predominantly white, supported lesbian and gay rights to legal marriage. And they first heard about the survey and blogs that covered detransition, other social media. So we evaluated whether individuals had early onset or late onset gender dysphoria by asking at what age they became gender dysphoric, and also did they become gender dysphoric during childhood, at the onset of puberty, during puberty, or later. And so we divided, so early onset was if they began to feel gender dysphoric during childhood. And it was roughly, half and half, early onset and late onset. And 55% of the natal females reported that their gender dysphoria began with puberty or later. And so this is that new presentation that we're talking about. One of the criticisms to the parent report study was that, well, all of these kids must have had early onset gender dysphoria and they just concealed it from their parents. So having these firsthand accounts from people talking about their own gender dysphoria is really helpful, because these individuals said this is when their gender dysphoria started. So there were differences between the female participants and the male participants, and these are the ones that were statistically significant, except for the mean year of detransition. So female participants were younger when they sought transition. They were younger when they decided to detransition, and they were younger at the time of the survey. They had a shorter duration of time that they were transitioned before deciding to detransition, and they transitioned more recently than the males. They were more likely to be exclusively homosexual, and that is based on natal sex. And they are more likely to have experienced the trauma less than 1 year before their gender dysphoria started, and more likely to have felt pressured to transition. So the vast majority of participants took cross-sex hormones. 1/3 of the females had breast or chest surgery, 16% of the males, and 6% had genital surgery. And to detransition, 95% stopped taking cross-sex hormones, 14% started taking hormones that were consistent with their natal sex, and 6% had surgery to reverse the changes from the transition. So the reasons for detransition were diverse, and the most frequently endorsed reason was that the individual's personal definition of male and female changed, and they became comfortable identifying as their birth sex. But people also had concerns about medical complications. They found their mental health did not improve with detransition. They were dissatisfied with physical results. They discovered that their gender dysphoria was caused by something specific, such as trauma or a mental health condition. And some people experienced discrimination and financial barriers. So I analyzed respondents' open text and short and multiple choice to identify different experiences around transition and detransition. And so I'm pointing out where the percentage of individuals that fell into each narrative. Most people did express more than one. So the narratives that are relevant to this talk are that gender dysphoria was caused by trauma or mental health condition, internalized homophobia, social influence, and misogyny. However, I would like to point out that 29% did detransition and experience discrimination and external pressures. Some had the experience of being non-binary, and some people did retransition. So again, these findings are the ones specific to psychosocial factors. But when participants were asked to describe how they feel now about identifying as transgender in the past, more than 1/3 endorsed the option of someone else told me that the feelings I was having meant that I was transgender and I believed them. And so this speaks to the social influence in how individuals interpret their own feelings and experiences to come to a conclusion about themselves. In this population, I did see some of these friend group dynamics described in the parent report study in terms of an increase in popularity when announcing a plan to transition, and groups that mocked people who were not trans identified. Individuals identified sources that they said encouraged them to believe that transitioning would help them. And 20% indicated that they felt pressure to transition by a person or group of people. And so This included clinicians, partners, friends, and online communities. So here are a few quotes that individuals provided to the "Did you feel pressure to transition?" And I'm only going to highlight a few of these, but one quote is that everyone says that if you feel like a different gender, then you just are that gender and you should transition. And so this is a ideological belief that has become very common and prevalent. So another person wrote, "By the whole of society telling me I was wrong as a lesbian." So this really, we've got a lot of work to do about homophobia. And several individuals wrote about their clinicians. "My gender therapist acted like it transition was a panacea for everything, and my doctor pushed drugs and surgery at every visit." And so if interactions like this can be verified and confirmed, this is really concerning. So other psychological findings, 58% of the population of the participants came to the view that their gender dysphoria was caused by mental health condition or trauma. And more than half had a belief that transitioning delayed or prevented them from addressing underlying conditions. So conclusions, the reasons and experiences around transition and detransition are diverse and include discrimination, concerns about medical complications, difficulty accepting oneself as LGB, coming to the view that their gender dysphoria was caused by a mental health condition or trauma. And a subset of detransitioners provided firsthand accounts that support the ROGD hypotheses. This study, like all studies, has limitations and more research is needed. So we're getting a little short on time, and I could tell you about a study that we conducted and is not published yet. We're still working on writing up the manuscript, but this was a study of individuals 18 to 33 years of age who had desisted or detransitioned. So we operationalized what we were looking for in terms of eligibility as identifying as transgender. So we didn't particularly say gender dysphoria. So participants had to identify as transgender for at least 6 months, and they had to have stopped identifying as transgender more than 6 months ago at the time of the survey. And so this study, actually, after an attempt to sabotage the anonymous collection of data, we had to regroup and make some decisions, and we changed the protocol in a way that all participants needed to be screened by video conference. So we have 78 individuals, predominantly female, but just going on because we're short on time. So we were able to dig a little bit deeper. So where the previous studies were really gathering information about psychosocial factors and asking whether it was relevant, in this study, we actually asked participants to rate how important different factors were for their becoming gender dysphoric and trans identified, and to rate factors, psychosocial and otherwise, on how important they were to the cessation of their gender dysphoria and relinquishing of a trans identification. So stay tuned. This is a work in progress, but it is very interesting. At least I think so. So what is the state of evidence about the ROGD hypotheses? And if I were to summarize an answer, I would say early, but increasing in strength. So this little picture illustrates sort of a stepwise progression of information. And so the first study was the parent report study. Shortly after that, clinicians wrote letters to the editor noting that they were seeing what was described in the research in their own patient populations. After that, individuals who detransitioned described themselves that the research was consistent with their own experiences of gender dysphoria and transition. The fourth step is the detransitioner research, where individuals provided firsthand accounts of their experiences of psychosocial factors being relevant to their transition and detransition. And then finally, is the research in progress about desisters and detransitioners. So in summary of the whole thing, there have been striking changes in the population seeking care for gender dysphoria. Psychosocial factors, including social influence, social contagion, maladaptive coping mechanisms, trauma, psychological issues, internalized homophobia, may be one of several explanations of why these changes are occurring. The relevance of these psychosocial factors has been demonstrated by secondhand and firsthand accounts. And so this emerging theory is completely consistent with the developmental conceptual model of gender dysphoria, but it challenges the innate gender identity model. So I expect there to be continued pushback and debate. Debate is good. And finally, more research is needed. I have a list of references here, which are going to be too small to actually read, but thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful, thanks very much for that. And if you want to have a look at the references, you can always go onto the YouTube and just pause and you'll be able to see the references. I feel like we should all give a round of applause. That was amazing. That's so many great slides in that. Somebody called you the Queen of Slides there. I don't know if you saw that.
I did not.
It's well deserved. It's good. Okay, so we're on time just about. There's been loads of really, really good questions. Yeah, sorry. Yes, slide goddess. I apologize, not queen. Slide goddess.
I'll put that on my CV.
Absolutely. So I'm afraid we're only going to be able to ask a fraction of these questions, these brilliant questions. So I'll just dive in. And I thought maybe I could start with you, Dr. Bell, and ask you this question. How do you counter the idea that the numbers of trans kids or teens has gone up because society is more accepting now? I've had this conversation with my ROGD team.
Well, I suppose the answer to that is that you can't absolutely say that it isn't due to that, but you just have to look at all the other factors that we've been talking about. I think the problem is not so much, I suppose a strong case I would put is that no child or young person should ever be given the label they're a trans child. One way of putting it is this, is if you imagine you've got two groups, if you've got a large group of children, let's say 100 children, young people. And let's say there's group A and there's group B. And group A are the ones who are going to persist. So they will persist in their belief about their other gender, past the age of 18, into their 20s, and may well transition. Group B, and there's a lot to suggest that group B is very, very much larger, will, with the right kind of help and support, will desist. Now, the first thing is to say we have no way of knowing if any particular child is in group A or group B. We have no research evidence at all to be able to predict. Therefore, how could we possibly take a child, not knowing if they're in group A or group B, and subject their normal body to medical irreversible treatment that's setting them on a pathway which will have irreversible consequences? So I would come back to my first, do no harm. So although one can't absolutely say that it isn't due to that, one can say that this is the only condition in medicine in which one prescribes drugs whose consequences we do not know to normal bodies. It's the only area of medicine that I know in which the treatment for someone who has difficulty managing something is to have irreversible treatment so that they can avoid it forever, in the belief that they can avoid it forever. So avoidance seems to be the treatment. And maybe the last thing to say, which I meant to say more before, is the heavy weight of consent. That is, some of you will know that in England and Wales, we had a judicial review which stated that children can't consent, and that's been overthrown in the appeal. But it's very important this isn't misunderstood. The appeal court decided that the lower court, the divisional court, did not have the authority to make this decision. They made no opinion on whether or not children can consent or not. They just said it wasn't within the realm of the court to say. They also didn't comment on the large number of serious, damaging criticisms that were made of the Tavistock Gender Service in the judicial review. So there's an awful lot wrong. At least in the English situation, we've had the case of Sonia Appleby, who was a child safeguarding champion for the Trust, who's just won an employment tribunal because it has discriminated against her for her views. So there's an awful lot wrong in these services, and that needs a lot of thinking about. But the first thing we have to do is do no harm.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Maybe have a question for Dr. Littman here, which has just come in. So I'm just reading it off the bottom of the chat here. Can Dr. Littman make any predictions about how her research will apply to the newer cohort presenting so much younger today? 12 to 14 for girls, 15 to 18 for boys since 2016, quite a bit after her population.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the question is. So how does this apply to the younger, maybe 12 to 14 year olds? So 12 to 14 would still be considered late onset gender dysphoria. And the cutoff really is about where puberty is. And with puberty occurring younger and younger ages, I think that would really be where the line is to determine late onset gender dysphoria versus early onset gender dysphoria.
Okay. I think I'll ask a question that anyone might be able to take before I come back to a more specific one, which is, do any of the panel feel that watchful waiting is even possible in today's expansive information environment that exists today? I don't know who wants to take that, whoever wants to dive in.
Well, I think that, watchful waiting could happen, but it is not a neutral situation at all, because there is just the culture and the society and the responses that are really promoting one particular view. So so you could watch and wait, but it wouldn't be neutral.
I think that's saying two different things, Lisa. The clinician is trying to be neutral, but you're recognizing that they're operating in a world that isn't neutral. But watchful waiting is an attempt to maintain some neutrality as far as one can. And that involves a great deal of the capacity of the clinician to contain within themselves the very powerful pressures that are being put upon them by the individual, by the family, by society at large. Don't know what you think, Stella.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think watchful waiting is a kind of a phrase from its era, and I'm not sure it's quite appropriate now. I think there's lots of phrases that could be used, but I think we're in a world where it's so pro in the media, in the film, in the social media, that I think the child who's been watchfully waiting is actually what they're doing while they're being watchfully waited. That's the problem. And if they're sitting on their online all the time, well, then that's not the spirit of watchful waiting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've got a question for Jude. So I'll read it. Jude, I'm sorry how difficult this has been to you and your family. If this didn't occur overnight, as you describe it, Would you have affirmed your child if they transitioned or started to transition earlier? If so, when and how would it been legitimate to choose your gender? And then it goes on, how old is your child now? What's the current status of where this gender journey has come to or arrived for them? I do just want to say that with the greatest of respect to the questioner, Jude did consistently describe her child using the pronoun she. So I would like just to point that out without wanting to edit the questioner's words. So the thrust of the question is, I guess, Jude, would you have affirmed your child if she transitioned or started to transition earlier?
I don't believe so. I strongly believe in what Dr. David Bell has said, that no child is trans. I believe that having had experience knowing people and knowing experiences like Stella, where she felt so strongly masculine as a young person, and that can change with maturity and the only way that can change is actually going through puberty and going through adolescence and maturing to be an adult. I have a very good friend whose nephew continually told his mother that he was a girl 40 years ago. He cried, he wanted, everyone's mean, they won't tell me that I'm a girl. He went through his adolescence and his puberty and he grew up to be a gay man. And when you hear stories like that and stories like Stella, this is why I don't believe in affirming young people, because this is a fluid thing and that can only be sorted out by going through puberty and going through your adolescence. And I also believe in the development of the decision-making centres and maturity of the brain, which that doesn't occur till you're 25, in your mid-20s.
That's right.
And so, therefore, I think waiting till an age like that, and then if it's still persisting, and obviously then that's a completely different situation. However, that is why I believe to wait till an age like that, when you're fully matured, when you're fully developed. And, sadly, I think so many of these young people most likely are. So, I mean, our daughter had told me she was a lesbian. And so I can see this terrible self-hatred of lesbians at the moment. It's something I've read in my research. And, that is terrible, that is what has happened in our society. And so that is why I'm strongly believing to wait till people are older. And now our daughter, she did stop testosterone. She's not taking that anymore. We had no contact all year, and she messaged me 1 week ago today, and I've seen her 5 days out of the last 7, and I can't believe that this has happened in this week. It's, she needs help. She's in a very, very bad place mentally, but she's reaching out to us for help.
I think there's so many people in the chat who are wishing you all the best.
Could I make a comment, Jude, just to back you up? Like if you'd met me, I was persistent, insistent, and consistent. I was, and you know what? Honestly, that's my personality. I'm a very forceful person. And when I was a kid, I certainly noticed the power of saying I was a boy, and parents kind of almost testing to see, adults kind of almost testing to see how far I'd go. And I was kind of belligerently going all the way, like, I'll show you. Yeah, I'll go all the way. That's personality type. So how can we measure the gender dysphoria? How can we take out the strength of personality and the kind of cockiness and the kind of, there's all sorts of other things going on in a child. It's not on its own. And so I really think, having had my own experience, I can't see, you can't show me any kid. And I just think, well, you should have seen me. You should have seen me, because I was very, very intense about it. I'm very sure of myself. I'm very confident and able to carry it, So therefore, I really back up what you said there, Jude, but it was very powerful as well. I just want to say it was such a powerful presentation you gave.
It really was. Okay. Another one here, this is really for anyone who wants to take it. I thought this was a really interesting question. I'm interested to hear thoughts on how space can be created for clinicians and others to roll back on very public positions they have taken which are unevidenced. I think it will be important to help really get to a place of evidence-based care. So how do you create the space for people to climb back down the ladder, so to speak? Whoever wants to take that.
That's an interesting question. I mean, those surgeons have climbed down the ladder, haven't they? They've decided that what they've been doing is wrong. I mean, I suppose there's a sort of general question. They've got the clinicians. One's got the most important area in all this is not what goes on in clinics. It's what goes on in schools and child and adolescent mental health services to some extent. Those schools that have been captured, and there's a very large number, that's where most of the damage, I think, is being done. So we need to create an environment which can help people think. I mean, in Britain, the government have produced new guidelines, which are very, very good, saying that schools shouldn't, you know, if a child is gender non-conforming, they shouldn't be told or even inferred that they're the other sex, because that's involving in a kind of binary view of gender identity. But so many of the schools are not following it. It's not being policed, and Stonewall is still managing and mermaids to influence what is said in schools. So while all that is going on, it makes it increasingly difficult for people to climb down. But if we can create a cultural environment in which we can limit the activities of Mermaid or Stonewall in education, if we can, in the media, and also in clinical services, it's that will create an environment in which it might become possible for some people to be able to change their position because of the change in the cultural world. I mean, if you consider it, a similarity might be that there were psychiatrists and psychotherapists, you know, say 40, 50 years ago, who thought that homosexuality was some kind of illness. And they changed, but they changed not because something in their profession changed. They changed because the social and cultural world in which they were functioning changed. And they started to see things in a different way, because we're all creatures of the cultural world we're in. So all that we can do to change that kind of cultural world will have the effect of opening up space for people to think. In the British situation, I don't think there should be a national gender service. We don't have a national service for all kinds of disorders. These should be managed in the ordinary child and adolescent mental health services so that all the other problems can be addressed. However, that will need a great deal of proper funding for those services.
Well, then maybe the next thing to do, seeing as you mentioned schools and you were very clear in saying that it's schools which is the battleground, I'll ask this question. Is anyone doing work with educating schools on how to handle children coming out as trans? Teachers are having 11-year-olds go around and state their pronouns along with their favorite ice cream flavor. What can we do as parents to engage with the schools and educate them about what's at stake here? Whoever wants to take that.
I'd like to say something about that. Schools is a really important influencing environment in our lives, from our education to our well-being in many, many different ways. Currently, I'm very, very concerned that a lot of schools have a lot of goodwill. They want to do the right thing and they're misinformed, and they think social transition is just a passing kind of non-event that you're just kind of rolling along with as a good teacher. I think they're not realizing that actually we've never done this. We've never changed pronouns. We've never given children the authority. Like, nicknames have been around for a long, long time. Generally, the teachers didn't use the nicknames as much as, you know what I mean, the children. Changing pronouns is a phenomenally powerful kind of event that hasn't got much research, but needs it. And until then, I think teachers should slow down and consider what they're doing. I know Genspect has let out a brief guidance, and it is available on our website. It's a brief guidance for schools. It's gone down very, very well. And weirdly enough, I didn't know that there was such a need, but we soon found out quite quickly that schools have contacted us saying, yeah, please help us. It's got messy. We're not really sure what to do. And these are schools, they want to be teaching geography and maths and English literature. And this has been foisted upon them. They've been told what to do. And then these are seasoned teachers, a lot of them, they're saying it's not going well. Now what do we do? So I think we really need to put a lot of focus on schools and a lot of attention to try and get this right.
How many more shall we go for? Do you want to keep going for a bit? Should we have another couple?
Well, can I just mention one that came up? I'm not saying I know the answer, so I'm not sure I want to take it, but I think it's a very different kind of question. Someone asked, do we know anything about the protective factors? That when you get, it's quite interesting, is it children in a class who is this huge thing, there'll be certain children who will be saying, no, I don't agree with that. And so the question is, do we know what kind of factors, what the protective factors that protect those children from being so caught up in it? And I suppose an additional question to that is, how can we protect those children to maintain their position?
Well, you can start us off with the answer there, David.
I don't know, but it does seem a very, I mean, I just don't know. It'd be interesting to find out, wouldn't it? It's some people obviously tend to go along. The more insecure people are, the more likely they are to go along with the culture in the school. The more less likely they are. So I suppose it must have something to do with something. I mean, what makes up that security? I don't know. But
I do think changing the conversation around what is kind, compassionate, and tolerant, that I believe that this fast tracking approach has wrapped itself up in saying that it's the only compassionate thing to do. And so I do think the discussions about a more comprehensive approach and, should be wrapped in that this is compassionate as well, or maybe
Yes.
more compassionate.
So somebody asked a question of me, I saw somewhere there, about, the be kind narrative. And, there's lots of ways to be kind. And, the best way to be kind with a child is to be thoughtful and to make sure that you're proceeding slowly and with care and attention. And being kind quickly, we all know it's very easy to quickly be kind to a kid. You can throw them an electronic device or chocolate and they'll think you're the kindest person in the world. But actually kindness does require thought. And I honestly think an awful lot of schools really want to do right by their students. I really do. And yeah. I think, the guidance that they've been given hasn't been great. And I think we're going to look back, and I think we're currently, it's interesting that this is the direction the webinar has gone. I think there's going to be a kind of a slight shrieking, oh my God, what's going on in schools? Because it's really, there's a lot of power in the school environment. And I think it really needs to be catered for.
Just seen Stephanie Davies arrive, the unstoppable, wonderful Stephanie Davies arrive from Transgender Trend, has left a comment here saying Transgender Trend is being invited into schools now to give advice on their trans policies. So behind the scenes, there has been a shift. A typical response from teachers is relief that what I'm saying reflects their own concerns. I bet there will be a lot of people who would really like to hear exactly what that shift is, what constitutes that shift. I mean, and in which countries and in which types of school, and there's a lot in that to be unpacked. But is that too optimistic to say there's a shift?
The famous tide is turning.
Yeah, the famous tide is turning.
It's been turning for some years now.
I think the children who are able to say no, and you do hear, I heard a story about a child, but I can't remember now, but it was something like the teacher in the class said, you know, we've now got to call John, Jane, or whatever. And one of the children said, oh, well, I don't understand that. It doesn't make sense to me. And the teacher responded by saying, well, that's hate speech. And so I suppose what would be quite important in terms of the relation to children is to say that children must be allowed to express their views. And they may not be the same as everyone else's, but to bully a child like that, or to give license to other children to bully them, is really a form of abuse.
Good for you.
But I think there's probably the teacher who said that, I think we would say was probably confused. And it's quite understandable that a lot of people are confused. Thankfully,
resources are starting to gain ground. Like Transgender Trend have an amazing resource. Safe Schools Alliance have a great one. Genspect are starting to build resources. So now it's starting to there's starting to be really serious kind of resources to hand. So it does feel that will kind of equip people, especially schools, to have the confidence to say there's more than one narrative here.
What a question, just to change gear a little bit, this is specifically for Lisa. Well, there's actually two. One of them's really quick. Would any of the desisters in the study classify themselves as ROGD? And then the second one is not quick. Can it be explained, this is from a teacher, can it be explained in layman's terms why Littman is so controversial and why her methods were so vilified? So either, whichever one of those or both that you want to take. So would any of the desisters classify themselves as ROGD? And why were your methods so vilified?
Right, so in the detransition study that's published, I did not ask individuals whether they would agree that with ROGD describes them. However, in the desister and detransitioner study, we did ask specifically, and some of them did acknowledge that, but we're still analyzing the data. So why were the methods of my study so vilified? I really believe that this comes from, one, an unwillingness to hear information that challenges the gender identity affirmative model. And the pushback was, I think the desire to push back comes first, and then the trying to figure out how to push back and what to pick at. And so, my study, it's an early descriptive study. It's not the end all be all. It's not the last study. It's the first study. And so those methods were the same methods used in other things. So it became really apparent to me. I even saw, there was one panel where my study was called methodologically atrocious, and another study was called phenomenal. And both studies use the same methods. So I think it was just that was a convenient thing to identify and to keep pushing at. So of course the methods have limitations. All methods do, but for where it is, I really think that the pushback came from a strong ideological place.
Right. I've got one here for Jude. Somebody has said, we know the importance of listening to parents. They have unique knowledge of their children. Would Jude mind sharing a few thoughts on how healthcare professionals such as nurses and doctors can support parents to voice their concerns and be heard?
Well, to listen to parents, and that is what the terrible experience we had was, that we were not listened to. We were instantly dismissed and called names. I mean, idiotic names like transphobic. I mean, I've come to believe in 3 years that word has just got no meaning, because I've never had a phobia against trans people. I mean, that's a crazy thing to say. I have grave concerns about a contagion that my daughter has been swept up in. And I've done a lot of research and run a lot of reading, and so I have reasons to have my concerns. But as I explained, when I've tried to talk to the endocrinologist about the concerns, I took articles, I tried to engage her in a discussion, and she shut me down. She wouldn't engage. Meaningless lines like, your daughter's 18, she can do what she likes. Don't you want to make your daughter happy? And they were the idiotic responses I received from from doctors and the staff in the mental health ward. Immediately, we have a son, and if you don't go along with it, she'll be dead. I mean, how can medical practitioners treat families like that? But that was how we were treated. And so to actually listen to parents who love their children, who care about their children, only want the best for their child, but to listen when there's comorbidities, when there's serious concerns, take the parents' concerns seriously and don't just assume that they've got a phobia or they've got some, underlying reasons for not going along with it. Well, there are underlying reasons, but they're quite sound and logical ones. And that was my experience, complete dismissal. And every letter I wrote, basically, I had responses indicating I was the one with the mental health problem and that I just had to get along and accept that this was the case. And to me, where is the medical curiosity in what is clearly a worldwide phenomenon that's happened? And, to not acknowledge what is happening around the globe in this circumstance is willful. It's willful, because it's creating a lot of harm and a lot of clearly misdiagnosed, young people are being harmed by being swept down the path and being immediately affirmed.
Can I come in on this? You're so right, Jude, and there's precedent for what you're saying. Anybody who works in mental health knows that you don't come in between the parent-child bond. You do it at your peril. And it's something that's just not done lightly, whether it's in school or in the mental health context. You just don't do that, because most parents are loving and engaged, and most parents care about the long-term impact of everything on their children. And that's why there's precedent for that parents are listened to from like pregnancy onwards, because there's a kind of an awareness that the parent really, really, really cares. But if you do come between a parent and child, you're splitting a family, and you're creating a really destructive, insidious, where the authorities at school or in the mental health clinics have become the voice of the child's rebellion. It gets into really complex, difficult, harmful waters, and that's why you don't split the parent-child bond easily. You bring them along. And that's one of the most pernicious aspects of this. I know it's getting late, everybody. I'm in New Orleans, so it's not late. But I know for those of you in Europe and the UK, I'll be in Europe tomorrow. I won't be laughing tomorrow. I'll be a wreck. But today I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, but I'm conscious Dr. Bell it'll be very late. Have you anything left there, Angus?
Yeah, well, I suppose what I'd like to finish on. First, I'd like to say everyone go to genspect.org and make sure you sign up, and make sure you visit all of our social media. You'll see all the icons up there, and have a go through the website. It's beautifully designed by my fair hand.
And the YouTube, this will be on YouTube. This conference will be on YouTube. And
yes.
Subscribe, please, because we want the numbers.
Do please subscribe, and do please like, because it raises our profile, and it means that other people will hear about these stories and we'll learn more about this. I just wanted to finish with, it's kind of a composite, because lots of people asked varieties of the same question, and one person saying, what can we do to dislodge this identity which is being imposed? Another one saying, how can we talk to our kids? How do we help them? Another one simply saying, what can we do? So I thought that would be the most natural place to end it, really, to say, well, what can parents do?
Well, they should join Genspect, and we can use their hands, or we can use their email abilities. There's a lot of volunteering to do, and you don't. Somebody said earlier you have to put your name to the parent accounts. No, you don't. We accept all sorts of different contributions from parents in many different ways, and I really think there's a huge strength. Thousands of parents are saying the same thing. They're saying they're not being listened to, and they believe that the quality of care that their children are receiving for their gender-related distress isn't good enough, and other issues are being ignored. And Jude's story said it all. Other issues are being ignored. And so, yeah, join Genspect, join Transgender Trend, support Safe Schools Alliance, support all the major organizations, and that's my contribution anyway.
Right, brilliant. Well, I think we've been going for nearly 3.5 hours now, so we better wrap it up before it becomes midnight on this side of the Atlantic, for those of us who aren't having a ball in New Orleans. So thank you very much. This was really great. Thank you to all of you. It was really fabulous. And we hope to see you again. Thanks very much.
I recommend a conference on gender in New Orleans, should you ever wish to go.
Does that mean you're not coming back? You're just going to stay there until we have a gender conference?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Angus, for all your support and help.
Thanks very much, guys.
You've done a great job.
Thank you.
And Stella for organising us all.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh.
Bye.